This is Derek. Derek is a xenomorph, or rather he's an egg that carries inside him an entity which will give birth to a xenomorph. Now, you see, Derek has fallen into the hands of a corporation who have brought him to a secret laboratory on the mining colony of LV-289. But first, they need a volunteer. Ah, here we go. This is Steve, one of the miners at the colony who has come to the lab under the false illusion they will be giving him free cake. Instead, Derek opens up to release Luke, a facehugger who latches onto Bob's face and plants an embryo inside him. Once the work is done, Steve falls off, his reason for living complete. Not long after, Luke begins to feel unwell, and out from his chest bursts our protagonist. Meet Barry, the xenomorph. In a strange turn of fate, the security system malfunctions, causing the doors and vents to open up. Whether this was a fatal error, or a vindictive move from a third party, we will have to see. Welcome to the life of a xenomorph. There is panic in the ore refinement factory. The company has ordered the evacuation of this part of the facility due to a chemical leak. Little do the workers know that the company is lying to them. Instead, it is Barry who has finally made his way out of the vent system into this part of the factory. However, the facility management have activated their defense bots, and two of them stand in the way of Barry and freedom. Dropping into the room, Barry quickly slithers to the nearest conveyor platform, being careful to stay out of sight of the security bots. Gaining height, he jumps from belt to belt before landing onto the ore intake platform and finding a crevice he can hide in until he grows to maturity. Barry has finally grown to maturity and became a full-fledged xenomorph. Now that Barry is a full xenomorph, he can begin to finally hunt the local colonists and fight back against their defences. Following the conveyor line, he pops up in one of several loading bays where ore is carried up from the underground tunnels. Inside is a large group of colonists. Easy pickings. It takes Barry less than a minute to claw and bite his way through them. Oh, but what is this? Barry appears to have left one of the colonists alive. Now, why would he do that? Before Barry can do anything for this final survivor, however, a security bot finally catches up to Barry. This time though, he can fight for himself, and after a tough battle, he manages to destroy his enemy. With the room now cleared, Barry grabs the survivor and throws him down the mine shaft before going down himself. Perhaps now it is beginning to become clear what Barry is planning. Eventually, Barry finds a place that will perfectly fit for his plans, and begins vomiting a black substance that he uses to trap the colonist in place. The drone subclass of Xenomorph are able to excrete this substance and use it to reinforce their nests. It would appear that we are extremely lucky as we get to see a rare part of the Xenomorph life cycle. If a Xenomorph is cut off from its hive, there is a chance they will undergo a metamorphosis and turn itself into a queen, which is exactly what Barry does. How lucky we are to see this. With this newfound position, Barry finds himself capable of laying eggs, and suddenly, it all becomes clear why Barry captured a colonist. The hive now has truly grown from one xenomorph to two. Just like its mother before it, the new xenomorph quickly grows into a drone. This new drone has many responsibilities to support his queen. The first of these new duties is to expand the hive by vomiting out this black substance that spreads Queen Barry's influence and allows for more humans to be captured. The drone's second responsibility is arguably just as important. It goes up to the surface and hunts for new hosts that can be brought back and used to create future members of the hive, both human and animal. Soon the hive has several new members, including those of a new subspecies of the xenomorph, nicknamed the Runner. From here, it won't take long for the hive to grow exponentially quicker, but this raises the question, will the humans find a way to fight back? As their numbers grow, so does the hive's boldness, with hunting parties going closer and closer to the mining colony every single day. The executives in charge of the colony are increasingly becoming more concerned. The amount of workers they are losing mean that they will certainly not meet their quota for this month. They had already sent a request for help from the company after the containment breach. However, they are yet to hear back. The workers themselves are beginning to become restless, as rumours that the disappearances around the colony are not actually the fault of accidents as the company claim, but rather of monsters. Realising that this position is untenable and that their own lives are at risk, the executives in the colony make a drastic decision. They send out a distress message, hoping that the government will send help. But will they arrive in time? The hive now numbers over 50 xenomorphs, but trouble is afoot. The humans have in their wisdom finally stopped sending out conveyors outside of the main colony and instead locked themselves inside, placing security bots on the entrances. How very rude. This decision has forced Barry to move the hive onto an offensive footing by sending a group of xenomorphs to attack one of the mine entrances. This assault takes the humans by surprise. The executives did not realise that the xenomorphs could be directed in any way, and assumed that they were simply primitive beasts. There was also the fact that the group was made up of a new breed of xenomorph, the Warrior. These xenomorphs are made for the sole purpose of killing any threats that may target the hive. It didn't take long for these new warriors to take out the bots guard in the entrance, allowing the xenomorphs free reign of the facility. It's been 2 days since the xenomorphs got full access to the facility, and chaos reigns. Xenomorphs are on almost every level with nothing capable of stopping them. Luckily for the humans though, help has finally arrived. A single strike force of marines passing through the system has picked up the colony's distress signal and deployed to the area. Each of these 5-man squads are made up of 7 marines, and each have their own objective. One squad is to secure one of the habitation facilities to form a base of operations and a place to secure survivors. Another squad are to take control of the food production plant, while a third shores up the main reactor for the facility. The remaining 2 squads are to go through the facility together, trying to locate and rescue as many survivors as possible. Barry pulls back a large portion of his forces into the tunnels to protect the nest. The Marines have valiantly fought back the xenomorphs, but things are about to change. Barry's runner scouts have discovered a new way into the facility that will allow them to strike the defenders where they least expect it. First though, Barry sends a group of xenomorphs to attack the reactor facility. Now, Barry is fully aware that his forces are not yet enough to overrun this part of the facility. However, this forms the perfect distraction. You see, the real assault will be conducted from the hive's new breed of xenomorph, the Nocturna. These xenomorphs' tails are instead designed to be more better suited to underwater activity, making them perfect to enter the facility through the water transferent pipes, allowing them to attack the food production plant directly. How will the Marines react to this surprise attack? With the xenomorphs having destroyed the food production plant, the 3 surviving members of the team assigned to defend it link up with the habitation block. With only 1 week of food left, small teams begin to go out and try and scavenge whatever food they can. Realising they need to take drastic measures, 2 of the Marine teams make their way down into the tunnel to try and bring the fight to the Queen. The Marines eventually find their way to the main nest, with only 8 of them remaining. However, to their surprise, there is no sign of Queen Barry. What the Marines do not know, however, is that Barry's scouts have gone deeper and deeper into the tunnels, and have recently found something that not even the company knew existed. These ruins would make the perfect place for Barry to create a new egg chamber. The second that Barry entered the ruins, however, ancient devices sent out a signal across the stars. One that would be answered by the ancestors of those who made the ruins. Meet Bob. Bob is a Yautja, also known as a predator. The Yautja are an old species of honourable hunters obsessed with collecting the skulls of and fighting the toughest foes. It is no wonder then that the Yautja have a long and storied history of the xenomorphs. Bob has made his way planet-side on LV-289 because an old Yautja ruin has sent out an automated distress signal alerting the species to the presence of a xenomorph queen in this ancient site. Bob is horrified to see that the humans have built their colony right above the entrances to the old ritual grounds, so to get entry, Bob will have to go through the facility. At the same time as this, a single ship lands not far from the facility. It belongs to the company. They have sent a single fixer alongside a small task force of bots to assess the damage on LV-289 and deal with it as they see fit. As Bob comes towards the entrance to the facility, he finally comes face to face with the real enemy, the xenomorphs. Here we see how the Yautja hunt. Their preference is to use their cloaking technology to get close to their targets before taking them out with a shoulder-mounted cannon and wrist bracers. Clearing these xenomorph warriors and drones is simple work for Bob. Once these chaff are dealt with, he makes his way into the facility. From the moment he enters, it is clear that the xenomorphs are running rampant throughout, and if there are any humans left, they will be hiding. The Yautja have been known to hunt humans for sport, however, in Bob's experience, their effectiveness as prey can vary greatly from human to human. On the other side of the colony, the company representative known as the Fixer strolls into the facility. Barry has just learned the presence of a Yautja, and he is very worried. The hive has finally grown strong enough to begin attacking the few remaining holdouts, and a new enemy is the last thing they need. It is time for Queen Barry to bring forth the newest of his breeds of xenomorph. The Crusher is the offensive powerhouse of a hive, capable of charging through groups of enemies with its tougher skin, meaning far more firepower is needed to take it down, while the Spitter, as its name suggests, spits out small blobs of acid at their enemies. The company Fixer arrives in the reactor control room and begins setting up his base of operations. He has one simple objective: to evaluate the situation and determine if the retrieval of live specimens is possible. If not, he's to recover what samples he can and leave the facility until more strike teams can arrive. Barry's hive are fighting their way through the facility at an impressive rate. These reinforcements brought by the company in an attempt to get the hive under control are doing little to slow down the Xenomorph's advance. The Xenomorphs are not just rampaging through the facility at random though, they are cutting a path directly towards the reactor room. For that is the nature of the Xenomorph, to destroy any living life form, focusing on those who pose a threat first. At the same time as this assault grows close, the Fixer is confronted by the Marines in the reactor control room. Once more, they demand that they be allowed to take some of his bots to try and evacuate the remaining civilians from the habitation blocks. The Fixer once more denies their request and makes it clear he expects the Marines to be aiding him, not the civilians. How will the Marines react to their requests being ignored? On the other side of the facility, Bob cuts a path through a group of Xenomorphs, bots and humans. He is surprised to see just how far the Xenomorph's nest is spread throughout the facility. He was fully aware just how deadly the Xenomorphs could be, but he had honestly expected more from the human defenders. To further complicate matters, according to Bob's old map, the fastest and most secure way to the ritual grounds was right behind this massive locked door. Using his Yautja wrist bracer, Bob is able to determine that the door is not opening because there is no power for it, the only place to redirect that being the central reactor room. It would appear that Bob is about to take to the battle for the reactor as well. The Fixer has finally had enough. The Xenomorphs are less than half an hour away from reaching the outer door to the reactor facility, and most of the Marines are still hunkered down in the habitation block, with the remaining 4 members of the teams that went into the tunnels having returned and linked up with them instead of the reactor. To make matters worse, the Xenomorphs are blocking the path back to the Fixer's ship. Infuriated, he confronts a single Marine team in the reactor and orders them to demand their colleagues come to his assistance. When the Marines pointed out the fact that would require abandoning the civilians, the Fixer made it clear that he did not care in the least, and if they did not come to his aid, when more teams from the company arrived, he would have them all killed. The Marines initially agreed, but at the first chance they got, they quickly abandoned the reactor to go to the habitation block. With no method of communication with the outside world, the Marines come up with a cunning plan to steal another ship, the one the Fixer came in. And so, the battle for the reactor begins. Hundreds of Xenomorphs charge across the walkways as what is left of the Fixer's team try and hold them at bay. Likely, they could have held the line for hours, possibly up to a day. However, there was something that they did not count on. Bob. The Yautja charges through one of the Xenomorph's advances and fights his way into the main reactor compound, using his stealth system to effortlessly move around. The Fixer didn't even have time to fully comprehend what had happened. Before he knew it, his security guards were eliminated and the Yautja was upon him. In the end, despite his high-paying position, the Fixer was only able to achieve next to nothing. With the power redirected, now it is time for Bob to make his way to fight the Queen and finally end this madness. Queen Barry is rejoicing over his ultimate victory. With the fall of the reactor, all that is left to stand against him is a handful of Marines and several dozen non-combatants, or as Barry prefers to think of them, future hosts. Barry's nest has grown so strong that it's begun to grow all over the facility, with an estimated 65% now being part of the nest. However, when the Xenomorphs attack the habitation block, they find nothing. Not a single human. You see, the Marines had abandoned the habitation block while the Xenomorphs were distracted with the reactor. They have a simple plan: to take the civilians, fight their way to the Fixer's ship, and hijack it for a ride off-world. After many hours of going through the tunnel, Bob finally arrives at the ancient ritual grounds. All that stands between him and slaying the Queen is a bridge guarded by Xenomorphs. On the end of the bridge are 2 Praetorians, the largest of the non-Queen Xenomorphs, who act as royal bodyguards. The battle is difficult and leaves Bob wounded, but eventually he manages to fight his way to come face to face with Barry. He is horrified by the desecration of his ritual site. Bob launched into combat without a second thought. Back above ground, the Marines finally fight their way to the ship and get the civilians on board. Getting there was tough, leaving them with only 9 Marines and 2 transports left. Aware from the Fixer that the company are sending even more teams, the Marines make a difficult choice. They allow the civilians to leave without them. Instead, the 9 Marines will return to the facility and overload the reactor to take out the entire Xenomorph nest. Crashing their vehicles into the facility, the Marines battle their way through corridor after corridor. Meanwhile, down far below, the Predator Bob battles with Queen Barry the Xenomorph, but eventually Bob's technology and combat prowess allows him to overcome the Queen. The fight was tough though. Leaving Bob extremely wounded and on the verge of death, dozens of Xenomorphs charge across the bridge towards him, drawn by their mother's death. Deciding not to allow any further dishonour come to the ritual ground, Bob charges across the bridge and sets his respirator to detonate. He'll take the Xenomorphs and the bridge with him. Getting to the reactor room, the 3 remaining Marines waste no time sending the reactor critical, taking everything, including every Xenomorph with them. And so it comes to the end. When the company purposefully let Barry escape, they had hoped it would teach them a valuable lesson about how Xenomorphs act and hunted in the wild. Admittedly, things had gone a bit out of control. However, the data was exactly what they needed. That in the bowels of the company's ship, the civilians used to flee, is a single stowaway. The Xenomorph horror was over. The survivors of the battle for LV-289 had managed to link up with the Colonial Marines frigate that had brought their saviours to the planet. After what appeared to be a thorough inspection, they were escorted safely to the nearest space station, a regional trading hub and hospital called Nocturna. Even as their ship landed in one of Nocturna's dozens of docking bays, the survivors could not believe they were truly safe. Every single one of them had witnessed the horrors of the Xenomorphs up close and appreciated just how unbelievably lucky they were to have survived their ordeal. Upon landing, they were greeted by the head of the hospital and his entourage. He welcomed them all and promised them that whatever horrors they had seen, they would be safe here. The first thing they needed to do, however, was to get an initial account from each of them of exactly what had happened. In time, they would all be processed and transported to whatever colonies or stations they individually wanted, all free of charge. Now, that instantly made them all suspicious. All of them had spent time working for the company, and the first thing that they each had learnt during that time was that this far out from Earth, nothing is free. As the survivors were led away, our protagonist of this new chapter appears. Meet Daniel, the Xenomorph. Daniel had been a humble drone serving Queen Barry, birthed during the later stages of the battle for LV-289. He had been exploring the company's ship when the survivors had taken off from the planet's surface. Cut off from his queen and unsure if he would ever rejoin his hive, Daniel's natural instincts kicked in, and he hid in the pipework of the ship, managing to barely avoid the Colonial Marines' sweeps. Now Daniel, like his mother before him, felt the urge to hunt and start a nest of his very own. So, scuttling away the Xenomorph goes, deep into the vent system. What neither the survivors nor Daniel yet realise, however, is that deep inside Nocturna is a dark secret. One which will be a test for both the survivors and the Xenomorph. As each survivor completes their one-to-one interviews with members of the hospital staff, they are afterwards brought to a floor of apartments. They are told that this will serve as their home until further medical checks can be completed. They are given no indication of how long this will take. Whenever one of the group voices their concerns, the staff reassure them that this is both temporary and necessary to make sure none of them are infected. What they are not told is that each room has secret cameras and one-way windows that allow scientists to spy on the survivors. You see, the entirety of the space station Nocturna is secretly owned by the company. They had been somewhat disappointed that the mining colony of LV-289 had been destroyed alongside all living specimens of the xenomorph genome that were present on the planet. They had gained valuable data from the experiment, but hoped that a living specimen might have somehow survived. While it was possible one of these humans had a chestburster inside them, it was unlikely, as it would have been birthed by now. These survivors could never be allowed to leave Nocturna and get in contact with any governmental organisations. However, they would form the perfect test subjects for those creatures locked away on level 251. Deep in the lowest levels of Nocturna, Daniel the Xenomorph hunts. The people this far down are treated like the dregs of society. The upper levels do not care about them, nor do they notice when they begin disappearing. This was the perfect environment for Daniel to hunt. The only downside was that most of these humans had weapons to defend themselves with, so he ended up killing far more than he had chance to capture. At first, a few bodies were found, then a few more. Then within a matter of days, most of the few dozen people living on the lower levels had disappeared or been found slain. Soon Daniel would begin the transformation into a queen and have to turn his sights towards the higher levels. The survivors have finally been given somewhat free rein. After a few days of questioning and scientific tests, they were finally allowed to leave their apartments on the condition they did not talk to the general public about what they had experienced, as to not create a panic. Despite this, however, they were not given free rein of the entire station, only allowed to go to a handful of shops and recreational floors. The company saw no harm in letting them wander around like this. After all, without the appropriate passes, they would never be able to leave these pre-assigned floors or communicate off-station. The arrogance of the company was absolute. To them, nothing these mere normal people could do would ever pose a threat to them or their plans. The survivors quickly begin hearing rumours of people disappearing from the work levels and are instantly overcome with fear. Panicking, they come together and go to try and warn the scientists that something must have been on their ship, that they must have been followed. The scientists wave their concerns away, telling them they probably have PTSD, and people go missing all the time. Secretly though, the scientists have become excited. If a specimen had escaped, this could provide some extremely interesting data for their project. Unsatisfied with their answers, one of the survivors makes a drastic decision. Meet Paul. Paul was a miner on LV-289 and had been working there for close to 5 years when the Xenomorph outbreak occurred. Ever since their escape, Paul has been unable to sleep for more than a few hours, plagued by nightmares of the Xenomorphs and what they had done. So it is no wonder then that Paul refused to accept the scientists' answers and instead went to find his own. During his walks around the Space Dome Park, he began asking people what they knew about Nocturna and these disappearances. This drew the attention of a woman called Eliza. She introduced herself as a hacker belonging to a social activist group that were investigating animal experimentation believed to be done by the company on this station. She tells him of a lab that she had discovered but cannot get access to without a key card that only scientists and guards have. Before leaving, Paul considered warning Eliza about his concerns and what had happened on LV-289. However, he was not quite ready to share that information with someone he had just met. And besides, Paul was not even sure that she would believe him. After all, if someone else had told him about this, he wouldn't have believed them either. Thus begins a dangerous plan. Deep in the lowest levels of Nocturna, Daniel's hive begins to grow. He is officially ascended to becoming a queen and has birthed eggs which will allow him to infect the humans he had previously captured. Now his nest numbers close to a dozen xenomorphs. However, Daniel intends to learn from his mother Barry's mistakes. Instead of striking quickly, Daniel intends to build the strength of his nest up over time. This shows one of the things that make the xenomorphs such deadly hunters. Despite their innate hunger to hunt and destroy, they are capable of learning and adapting how to overcome their prey. Where Barry ignored the threat posed by the human element, focusing on gaining ground and defeating the strongest humans first, Daniel will instead be more tactical. His nest will try and remain hidden and undiscovered until they number enough xenomorphs to overwhelm the station. Within a matter of days, the nest had spread across almost the entirety of the lowest 4 levels of the station. These levels, over the course of the station's long life, had become almost completely ignored, as they housed old but reliable machines that rarely broke down. This turned those levels into a place for the criminals and outcasts of society to hide. The small guard force responsible for maintaining law and order had long abandoned any notion of policing these areas. Eventually though, Daniel's nest had taken out everyone on these lower levels, and individual drones were sent out to find people to bring back to the nest from up above. On a few occasions, these scouts would come into contact with armed guards, which they quickly dispatched. This would draw attention towards something happening on the lower levels. However, the security forces lacked the manpower to truly investigate. It seems like this time the xenomorphs might truly win. After his conversation with the hacker Eliza, Paul has become convinced something sinister is going on in this station. So down he went towards the lower levels of Nocturna. Eliza had told him that a few security guards had gone out of contact down there. She had managed to give him an access card that would let him use the elevators without anyone else finding out. However, if he was discovered by the guards, he would surely be in a lot of trouble, and the other survivors would have their passes revoked. He exited onto level 6, the lowest this elevator went to. It was dark and damp, with a strong smell of mould all around him. It immediately became clear to Paul why no one liked coming this far down. The deeper he went, the more strange sounds he would hear echoing off in the distance. Paul considered turning back, but he couldn't. No matter how afraid he was, he had to push on, to know for sure if they were actually safe from the xenomorphs. Eventually, Paul found what he was dreading, a security guard ripped to pieces. It was clear the guard had fired his gun several times and seemingly missed what he was shooting at. Paul knew instantly that a xenomorph had done this. After all, he had seen a xenomorph's handiwork before. Searching the guard, Paul found a security key card, one which would give him access to the laboratory. Quickly, Paul returned to the higher levels, before going to visit the other survivors. He quietly warned them what he had saw, and told them to be ready. He knew they wouldn't be allowed to simply board their ship and leave due to the guards, So instead, Paul decided to investigate the lab and unearth what is truly going on here. With his keycard taken from the guard in hand, Paul makes his way to the laboratory in the dead of the night. Nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. There were xenomorph bodies in various states, with xenomorph skulls littering work areas. It seemed this entire lab was dedicated to the research of the xenomorphs. This changed everything. Paul had assumed the xenomorphs were natives of LV-289, and that maybe it was their own mining operation that drew the attention of the aliens. But now he began to realise that the company must have had a lab like this on the colony. Deeper into the laboratory, he came across a door that was labelled Live Specimen Freezer 9. Looking inside, Paul was horrified to see dozens of facehuggers frozen in test tubes. The Marines who had gone into the nest on LV-289 had warned them about these, that once you were infected, it was too late. He knew the survivors needed weapons. If they could just get their hands on some firepower, they could fight their way to their own ship and escape. Perhaps the lab had some. After all, there is no way a lab would have xenomorphs in it without any weapons to stop them if they broke free. That would just be reckless. So Paul continued exploring. Eventually he came across Containment Chamber 1, and curiosity got the better of him. Inside, he found something he had never seen before. A Yautja. Meet Ronald. In abject horror to the realities of this lab, Paul goes to leave. However, it would seem he was nowhere near as careful as he thought he was. The head scientist of the station, alongside the head of the hospital, the head of the station security, and a few security guards arrived, weapons raised. They detained Paul, rounded up his fellow survivors, and placed them all under house arrest at their apartments. They were told if they tried to leave the area, the guards were allowed to deal with them however they saw fit. With guards stationed on each entrance to the flat block, the survivors found themselves talking in whispers and makeshift code. They all were in agreement that they needed to escape here as soon as reasonably possible. The question, however, was how. Even if they managed to take out the guards on the entrances, how far could they reasonably get before reinforcements took them out? Further down on the lowest levels, the Xenomorph hive is beginning to reach the next stages. Just like the hive on LV-289 before it, Xenomorph warriors are beginning to appear alongside the runner subspecies. The warriors specifically were becoming stockpiled by Daniel. Where his mother Barry sought to immediately send them into battle, Daniel plans to get as many warriors as he can before the nest can grow large enough to simply overrun the rest of the station in a single foul swoop. On the higher levels of the station, the social activists prepare to make their move. Eliza, their hacker leader, had finally, after months, created a program that would let them hack access to the laboratory and control its internal systems. So they went as a group, entered the laboratory, and through force took control of it. As soon as they were in control, they locked the primary doors to prevent the guards from getting back inside. Once they got into the lab itself, they were disgusted. They had expected to find animals, and instead they found aliens. Actual proof of extraterrestrial life, and the company had been hiding it from humanity. Not only that, but they were clearly actively experimenting on these cute little tailed aliens. They decided it was their new mission to liberate these alien life forms and give them a new, better home. Before they had a chance to do that though, they came across Ronald the Predator in his containment chamber. It quickly became clear that this humanoid was also an alien, and an intelligent one at that. Ronald made no sound, but simply stared at these humans in idle curiosity. After a few minutes, Eliza managed to disable the security on all containment and freezer rooms, freeing all the aliens. It only took a few seconds for them to realise their mistake. The activists in the freezer room and corridors instantly became attacked by facehuggers. Meanwhile, dozens, if not hundreds more, retreated into the air vent system to spread across the wider station. The security systems in place to prevent their escape had all been disabled by Eliza. Mortified by the consequences of her own actions, she turned around to see Ronald's security barrier had also been disabled. Ronald had been in that containment cell for a very long time, and wanted revenge on humanity. Unfortunately for her and her team, he did not care which humans he took that revenge out on. Now that he was loose, the Predator turned his eyes towards retrieving his own equipment. The facehuggers begin launching out of the vents in highly populated areas, infecting civilians by the dozens. The few guards that Nocturna has send frantic radio messages, begging for backup that will never come. Back in the apartment blocks, the survivors hear this over the radios carried by their captors. This was everything that they had feared. The Xenomorphs were here. They knew from experience that they had at best a few hours before the first Xenomorphs began to appear and run rampant across the station. The survivors knew that there was no way for them to escape before the coming carnage without violence. They would have to fight their way out, but how would they do that when both the guards had weapons? In the laboratory, Ronald the Predator battles his way through each room. He kills any who he comes across. Be they human activists, scientists, or facehuggers, none escape his wrath. This is not simply mindless slaughter, though. Ronald is looking for something specific, and eventually he finds it. His equipment. When he was captured all that time ago, he still had multiple pieces of Yautja equipment with him. Now all that remains of the bounty is his wrist bracers and a single mine. His helmet and the rest of his equipment have been deconstructed. His wrist bracer was all he needed, however. With it, he would be able to send a signal requesting more predators. With the facehuggers being loose all across the facility, the squad of guards in the apartment block make the decision to pull back, only leaving 2 of them behind to detain the survivors. The survivors see this as their chance to escape. The more hot-headed among them want to charge the guards and try to overpower them. Paul, however, refuses to even consider such an idea. He wishes for all of his people to get out alive, so he doesn't want to take such a drastic risk. Instead, he approaches the 2 guards and desperately tries to plead with them. Paul tries to explain to them the truth about what had happened on LV-289, about what was happening now, what he had truly seen in the station. Instead, he is met with disdain, and one of the guards draws his weapon on Paul. Paul, despite being terrified, gives one last speech to attempt to avoid any bloodshed. Despite his best efforts, however, the guard has enough and goes to shoot Paul. Before he's able to do so, however, the other guard knocks her colleague out. This guard introduces herself as Rachel. She had been listening to every word Paul had said, and had been listening to the frantic screams of her colleagues on the radio, leading her to realise just how correct Paul was. She tells the survivors she will help them, but first, they need weapons. Down in the Xenomorph nest, the first of the newly birthed chestbursters arrive. Within a matter of seconds, they analyse the hive and choose to accept Daniel as their queen. The first of the chestbursters have finally grown into Xenomorph drones. Finally, Queen Daniel feels confident enough to send out her legion of drones and warriors to overrun the station. Across every level, drones burst out the vents, closely followed by warriors. The hundreds of humans panic helplessly, trying to escape, while they either get eliminated or dragged away into the lower levels of Nocturna. The survivors of LV-289 stay away from populated areas. Guided by their new ally Rachel, they use her security clearance to get past locked doors and access restricted corridors to move as quickly as possible. She leads them to the nearest guard station, hoping to loot one of the armories. Inside, they are greeted by another guard who was hiding from the Xenomorphs inside. This guard quickly realised that Rachel had joined the survivors and was disobeying orders. She tried to explain there was no point following those orders anymore and that Nocturna was going to fall. But her colleague failed to see reason and began shooting wildly at the survivors, barely missing his shots. Rachel was left with no choice but to fire back, taking out her co-worker. Rachel then raids the armory, giving each survivor weapons and taking 2 turret packs. Now they would have to find a way to disable the security lockdown on the hangar containing the survivors' ship, somehow get to said hangar, and then escape. At the same time as this, the Predator Ronald arrives in one of the main hangar bays on the other side of the station, and using his wrist bracer disables the security for it, allowing a Yautja ship to dock in the bay. From the moment the Predators stepped off the boarding ramp, tensions were high. You see, in Predator culture, it is a great dishonour to be captured. In the case of defeat, a Yautja is, regardless of the situation, expected to self-destruct their wrist bracer to both prevent the capture of Yautja technology and also wash away some of the shame. Ronald had been captured by the humans before he had chance to do this. The fact that he had been caught in a human trap did not matter. To Yautja society, Ronald was the worst kind of criminal and renegade, one who deserved nothing but death. Among the reinforcements was an elder predator who was leading this hunting party. This old blood made it clear that this transgression would be punished. However, not until after the Xenomorph threat was dealt with. While nothing Ronald could do would bring forgiveness or understanding, perhaps dying to one of the great foes of old would return a small particle of honour. The Elder announced that the Predators would split into multiple small teams. One would destroy all the data in the lab that had been collected on the Predators. One would set the station to crash into the sun to make sure the work was done, and the rest would be sent into the nest to hunt for trophies. Ronald was to go in a pair with a new blood called Kratos and join in the purging of the nest. For the Predators, the opportunity to fight Xenomorphs was one of the greatest honours. However, the Elders did not send Ronald on this mission as a chance for honour. No, instead, this was to be the New Blood's very first hunt. They had been en route to take Kratos for this memorial occasion in a young Yaltra's life, but the Elder decided that this would be a far more honourable hunt, and would get the New Blood the chance to see what dishonour looks like, so that he may learn how not to become like Ronald. Thus, the hunt begins. The human survivors are struggling to make progress. The Motherbox AI responsible for controlling the electronics on the station has detected Rachel's betrayal and has redacted her keycard's access. Now the survivors must make their way through the general corridors. Luckily, when they raided the armory, there were enough guard armour and weapons to kit out all of the survivors. Paul was the only one to refuse wearing the armour, knowing in reality it would do nothing to stop a Xenomorph's attack. It doesn't take long for them to come across the first Xenomorphs. Luckily, their looted weapons are strong enough to take them down and force them back. The first place the survivors want to visit is the Motherbox AI room. Disabling it is the only way that they can deactivate the security override on the hangars and allow the survivors to escape. Eventually they come across one of the many food production farms. The wheat and other crops raised so high that the survivors could not clearly see if any Xenomorphs were hiding in the crops. So Paul and Rachel volunteered to go in first and make sure it was safe. They moved slowly, sticking to the paths and aiming their weapons into the farm. At first, things were going well, until a single crusher comes charging through the crops. Paul was aware that some Xenomorph subspecies could be this big, but this was his first time ever seeing one. Paul screamed at Rachel to go wide, to treat it like a bull, let it charge, roll out the way, then fire at its back and sides. As he did this, Paul realised the crusher was coming for him, and barely avoided being hit himself. Turning, he released a hail of fire from his own weapon. This, combined with Rachel's, was enough to take the crusher down. They had survived, but it was close. This just reinforced the sentiment that they needed to escape as soon as possible, before even bigger enemies could appear. The Predators, Ronald and Kratos, are moving towards the lower levels of Nocturna at speed. Between the two of them, any Xenomorphs they come across are easily dispatched. Things are not well, however. The two of them are continually butting heads. Ronald acts cautiously, knowing that one wrong move against a Xenomorph can end in death. Kratos notices this and accuses Ronald of cowardness, saying it is far more honourable to charge head first into combat. It reminds Ronald of how he used to be in his youth. Something that he learned after his first few hunts is that arrogance is the leading cause of death in young predators. For his part though, Ronald is content to ignore the youngling's jabs. If he wishes to see Ronald as a coward, then so be it. Ronald knows the truth. Soon they come across a group of warriors in a water treatment plant. Before Ronald can warn him not to, Kratos fires his shoulder cannon, which successfully hits one of the warriors, but also blows a hole in the wall, sucking Kratos off into space, while Ronald desperately held onto a railing. Soon, an energy shield covered the breach, and gravity returned, hurling Ronald into the water below. He knew that Kratos had probably survived. With their helmets, a Yautja can survive for short periods of time in the vacuum of space, and Kratos would likely use his claws to dig into the outside of the station. The two of them would have to link up later. Before Ronald could consider how to do this, however, he was attacked by Nocturmorphs. These water-based hunters had the advantage in aquatic environments, and a lesser predator would have easily been overwhelmed. Ronald, however, had fought these foes before, and knew just how to handle them. One small massacre later, Ronald hurls himself out of the water and continues his story. A few minutes later, he comes across a window. Through it he sees hordes of Xenomorphs clawing their way along the outer shell of the station. It seems that not even the cold, uncaring void is enough to kill Xenomorphs. He watches a few of the repair androids from the station's robot workforce meet the aliens in battle. And of course, there was Kratos, fighting them all. After being separated, Ronald used his wrist bracer to send a message to Kratos. Kratos was to use the nearest airlock, get inside the station, and link up with Ronald at one of the core elevators that would lead them close to the nest. It took around an hour, but eventually Kratos arrived. The youngling seemed on edge. His mask was missing, and when questioned, he told Ronald a warrior jumped him as he entered. When it died, its acid burnt through the mask's optics, so he discarded it. Regardless, the two of them would take the elevator and continue their hunt into the nest. Back with the humans, they finally break their way into the Mother Box AI room. Getting in was not easy and required plasma cutters looted from the guard armory to cut through the door. Once inside, Rachel begins to use the manual override to force the AI to disable the lockdown on the hangar with the survivors' ship, as well as any automated defences preventing them from taking off. She also sees in the AI's database that the nest is growing from the very bottom of the station upwards. Now they had everything they needed. The survivors in their stolen guard uniforms could make their way to a nearby interstation small shuttle and fly next to the hangar with their ship. Before they could leave, however, they were interrupted by another predator. The predator launches into the survivors, slaying one of them instantly with his claws. Once the initial shock wears off, the survivors open fire. Their shots barely miss as the predator dives out of the way and claws off the head of another survivor. Paul was absolutely horrified. This not only clearly wasn't a xenomorph, but was also far more deadly than any single xenomorph they had encountered. Just as Paul raised his weapon, he watched in horror as the creature disappeared right before his eyes. The survivors were all panicking, no one knew what to do. The thing had taken out Terry and Dan. They had readied themselves to fight xenomorphs. They at least knew slightly what to expect. This was completely unprecedented. Suddenly, and without warning, another one of the survivors, Harry, gets blown apart by a blue light. Before any of them could even process this, the creature is back in their ranks, using its metal claws to sever Luke in half. The creature turns, the eyes of its metal mask meeting Paul's face. The creature raised its claws and was about to bring it down when Rachel crashes into the predator, knocking it off balance, causing it to stumble several steps. In retaliation, the predator knocks Rachel aside, but before it can finish her, a horde of xenomorphs come jumping from the roof. The survivors flee, running to the nearby interstation shuttle and quickly boarding it. Paul and Rachel are the last of the group to arrive. Just as Paul walks on board, however, a xenomorph drone comes leaping from a vent in the roof and grabs hold of Rachel. Paul goes to raise his weapon, knowing if he does, the acid blood will spray onto Rachel. In that moment of hesitation, another one of the survivors clicks a button to close the door, and Paul is forced to watch as Rachel is dragged away by the drone as his shuttle launches into space. It takes the survivors' shuttle 10 minutes to fly to the other side of the station and dock. From here, they are 15 minutes walk from the ship they arrived to Nocturna on. Unlike these small shuttles, it has the internal functions and speed to support them until they can get to a new colony. Perhaps this time they will finally be safe. Paul turns to look back at the shuttle. He tells the other survivors no. He just can't leave Rachel behind, especially after she saved him from the monster. He tells them the xenomorphs would have dragged Rachel to the nest, so alone he will go to the nest, find her, and rescue her. With the shuttle, he could get to one of the docking bays in the heart of the nest itself. The other survivors look hesitant at Paul. They all realise this is next to impossible. Reluctantly, they realise there is nothing they can do to stop him. The survivors give him one of the 2 auto turrets they stole, and tell him if they manage to rescue her, they will try and come pick them up. Paul goes back into the shuttle to take off, while the rest of the survivors go to battle their way to the hangar. Now both xenomorphs and station repair bots stand in their way. The robots have gone crazy and begun attacking anything nearby ever since the Mother Box AI was disabled. Down in the lower levels of the nest, Ronald and Kratos step off the elevator. From the second they leave it, they are confronted by xenomorph warriors. They begun a slaughter, fighting their way deep into the nest. Soon they came across a Praetorian, the first sign that they were getting close to the Queen's chamber. Fighting this large xenomorph was a tough battle. While they managed to defeat it, Kratos suffered substantial injuries from the Praetorian's claws. Kratos refused to rest, however. On his honour as a Yautja, he would see the Queen slain by his hands. In the Mother Box AI room, the Predator that attacked the humans finally finished slaying the last of the xenomorphs in the room. It had taken far longer than he had liked, but every time he killed one, another appeared. Using his wrist bracer, he reactivated the Mother Box and forced it to override the station's ancient engines. Within an hour, the station would be crashed into the nearby star. Queen Daniel is preparing to fight. He has become aware that the predators are closing in on the heart of the nest. When this happened to his mother Barry, she sent the Praetorians out to slay the predator. Daniel never did know what became of his mother, but he has his doubts if she survived. These predators are the only threat that can defeat him, so unlike his mother before him, he calls home his Praetorians. When the predators arrive, there will be no match for 3 Praetorians and Daniel together. Paul lands his shuttle and exits into a dark corridor. The loading bay leads him into what was once one of the many hospital wings in Nocturna. When the nest began to expand rapidly after the release of the facehuggers, It was one of the last areas on the upper-lower levels to hold out, the weak and crippled barricading themselves inside using furniture and medical equipment, hoping it would hold the Xenomorphs at bay. Now it is just another extension of the nest. He moves slowly, trying not to bring attention to himself. Every corner could hide a Xenomorph after all. Before he knew it, a facehugger came launching at him. He barely managed to get out of the way. He began to sprint, not wanting to get bogged down in a fight. Off in the distance, he sees it, an elevator. Running with all speed, he crashes into the elevator before turning and unleashing a hail of gunfire from his weapon. He clicks the button and the elevator drops down, taking him into the heart of the nest. In the Queen's chamber, the Predators Kratos and Ronald arrive. Before them is the Queen and 3 Praetorian bodyguards. Around the chamber, the bodies of other predators. It would appear multiple of the other hunting parties had arrived and been defeated. Without hesitation, Kratos charges in head first. After what seemed like eternity of moving through the nest with his weapon drawn, Paul finally comes to an alcove, drawn by the sound of fighting. With every second he has to fight the fear to prevent it from paralysing his body. As he enters the alcove, he turns and there he sees her, Rachel, attached to the wall by goo. He runs over to help her and asks if she had been infected. She tells him no, they didn't have a chance. They brought her here, strung her up, but before they could infect her, more of those creatures from earlier arrived and started fighting them. He pulls her out, and as they go to leave the chamber, Paul takes one last look back at the fight below, before leaving even more horrified than he was before. In the pit below, the battle is going poorly for the Predators. Both of them are getting thrown about by the 3 Praetorians and the Queen Daniel. There is no chance for rest, or even to think. This is clearly not a fight they can win. Kratos is too injured, his earlier wounds finally catching up to him, and Ronald would never have been able to take on all 4 of them at once anyway. Seeing the abysmal state of affairs, Ronald decides it is time to do something truly drastic. He runs towards the nearest Yautja body. The other hunting parties had failed to kill the Queen as well, but their equipment could still be of use. Ronald rips the mask and shoulder cannon off the Predator and equips them on himself. Kratos, wounded, watches this from the other side of the chamber. The Praetorian that knocked him there slowly approaching, ready to finish its kill. Ronald shouts over, telling the Youngblood to dig his claws into the floor and hold on. Kratos does so without question, and watches as Ronald fires a single round from the stolen shoulder cannon. Not at any of the aliens, but instead into the wall behind them. Caught off guard, the Praetorians are thrown into the void. Daniel, however, claws at Ronald as he falls, destroying the shoulder cannon. Daniel then slams his claws into the side of the hole, refusing to be sucked out into the void. Before the Queen can drag herself back into the station, however, Ronald comes flying at her. Using his momentum, he launches the 2 of them into space. Ronald smashes into one of Nocturna's solar farms. He was lucky to have crashed into another part of the station. Honestly, he did not expect to. Looking up, he sees the Queen charging at him. It appears Daniel was lucky too. Ronald knows he won't hold out for long, even with his mask. To Daniel's shock, Barry turns and runs away further along the solar farm. The Queen gives pursuit, desperate to slay this predator for what it had done. Soon, Ronald reaches the end of the farm. With nowhere left to run, he is forced to fight Daniel, who obliterates the aging predator with ease. Ronald laughed in his mask. If they weren't in space, Daniel would have heard it, although Ronald doubted such a creature knew what the sound of laughter even meant. Ronald knew he would lose, of course. He was too old and too wounded to take on a queen alone. So he left his wrist bracer behind and set it to detonate. The explosion detached the arm of the solar farm they were on and sent it barreling into the depths of space with Daniel and the body of Ronald on board. Back in what had been a hospital, the elevator arrives. Multiple facehuggers and drones stand ready to capture the humans. However, when the elevator arrives, they are not just met with prey. No, there is also an auto-turret which begins ripping the Xenomorphs apart. Once its firing stopped, Paul and Rachel run through the lab back to the shuttle. As their shuttle begins to launch, it's thrown off course. The explosion caused by Ronald was of such force that it shook the moving space station, causing the shuttle's engines to become damaged. Paul and Rachel drifted in the shuttle, watching as the station got pulled into the sun. The shuttle lacked any communications array, and they had under an hour of oxygen left. They may have survived the Xenomorphs, but it would appear they would die in space nonetheless. Just as they accepted their fate, however, the cockpit was lit up with lights. The other survivors of LV-289 had found them. The humans weren't the only ones to escape, however. Wounded but still alive, Kratos had managed to return to the Oucher ship and leave the station. Over half of their hunting party had been slain, but for those who survived, they had reaped a worthy bounty of trophies. The Elder told Kratos he had done well surviving while the coward died. Kratos corrected him that Ronald was not a coward, he died with honour and should be remembered for that. After the Elder left his room, Kratos reflected. Ronald had shown him what he saw as both honour and dishonour. Unfortunately, Kratos had learned his own dishonour. He had lied about how he lost his helmet. Suddenly and without warning, his chest exploded as the secret he was too afraid to tell anyone of came bursting out. Meet Bobby, the predalien. The battle for Nocturna had ended. The Xenomorph horrors had been defeated, their queen slain, and the nest thrown into a star. While this hunt was over, the surviving predators of the battle for Nocturna were already on their way to their next hunt. During the brutal destruction of the laboratory on Nocturna, the Elder learned that much of the information the humans had collected on the predators had been sent to a planet they called Vultra. Vultra had in turn sent numerous files regarding the Xenomorphs and a facility referred to only as the Farm. Upon learning of the building's purpose, the Elder decided his party would put a stop to this as soon as possible. He'd sent word to the rest of his clan, but they were on the other side of the galaxy on their own hunts. He did not know how long it would take for them to mobilize on a location so far away. Unfortunately for the Predators, their ship had been infiltrated. As they made the final approach to the atmosphere of Vultra, the Elder requested the presence of all Yautja on the bridge. When Kratos did not reply, he sent one of the Predators to Kratos' quarters, where he found the young Predator with his chest burst open. They all knew exactly what it meant. Kratos had been infected, and an abomination was now loose on their ship. There had been several recorded cases of a Yautja being infected with a Xenomorph. The result of this often referred to as a predalien. These crossbreeds are considered the ultimate affront to the species' honour. When one is identified, the entire species are normally willing to put aside differences to guarantee such an abomination does not survive for long. The Predators hunt the ship using their masks to try and find it. The young predalien Bobby had hoped not to be discovered until they had at least grown to adulthood. He knows he cannot hide forever, and soon the Predators find him hiding between some pipes. Not being able to use their shoulder cannons due to being in a ship, they attempt to slice Bobby with their claws. He weaves between their attacks and flees to the bridge. A reckless Predator launches at Bobby, slicing wide, hoping to cut him in half. However, the predalien dodges at the last second, and instead the Predator's claws slam into the control console, causing the ship to lose control and be pulled off course into Vultra's atmosphere. The Elder took control of the controls, trying to steer the ship away from the city that they were now on course to crash into. With great skill, he managed to right their course and crashed just outside the city's limits, which was a few hours' walk of their initial landing zone anyway. The landing, however, was rough, wrecking the ship in the process and embedding it into the ground. As the smoke begins to settle, Bobby the predalien slithers out from the wreckage. Off in the distance he can see a city, and with it, the promise of prey. So into the woods he goes, on a mission to reach civilization. Not long after Bobby's escape, the remaining Predators climb their way out to their destroyed ship. Only 4 of them survive the crash, but it will be enough to slay any threats they come across. Might alone will not win this, however. The abomination is loose and will most certainly grow to maturity before they find it. The Elder is certain it will go to the city. He'd spent many centuries hunting the most ferocious prey the galaxy had to offer. During these years, he had fought the Xenomorphs more times than he could count. He knew how they fought and how they acted. There is also the matter of the farm. He knows it is located somewhere in the city, although the exact location is not clear. Finding it won't be difficult, but going for it right away might allow the abomination to slip through their grasp. Being an ever-pragmatic leader, the Elder allows his fellows to make their cases to him. After a heated discussion, he makes his decision. The chance of a predalien getting away is worse than allowing the humans to continue their research into their own culture for a few more days. They will slay the abomination, then they shall destroy the farm and the entire research facility with it. Before they have chance to leave, they are discovered by a group of human farmers from the local area, drawn by the crash. Armed with simple weapons, they foolishly confronted the Yautja. The Elder gives a simple order: leave no witnesses. On the border of the city, Bobby slithers his way into a grate into the sewers. The predalien Bobby has found his way to a city. Welcome back to the life of a Xenomorph. In the dark, damp sewers, Bobby matures to adulthood. The adult predalien is a class above its fellow xenomorphs. Its appearance often comes off as a half-xenomorph, half-predator crossbreed, with it bearing the distinct mandibles and dreadlocks of the predator species. While their appearance tends to be more familiar to the warrior caste, they actually are closer to Praetorians in terms of ability. They inherit the Oucher's strength, with it often being observed to match that of a Praetorian, although they lack their larger xenomorph cousins' resistance to damage. That is not to say they are easily destroyed. A Predalien's skin is far stronger and more resistant than that of a warrior's, with them being able to shake off most attacks against them. This, when combined with the Predalien's lightning-fast speed and reflexes, make them fearsome hunters. To top it all off, they have a unique level of intelligence and independence rare for the species. Now that he has grown to adulthood, it becomes time for Bobby to go on his first hunt. Something is weird, however. He can detect the presence of a queen nearby, clearly somewhere in the city, but the signal is off. It's wrong. He cannot understand what the queen wants nor where it is. He would have to scour his way through the city and find the queen. In the meantime, he practices his skills on a criminal gang he comes across in the sewers. While being armed with firearms, these are not the high-caliber rifles of the colonial marines, or the weapons the company had on Nocturna to contain a xenomorph outbreak. These weapons lack the penetration and strength to even pierce Bobby's flesh. These humans first try shooting the predalien. When that doesn't work and he begins tearing into them, the majority begin to flee. None would escape. In an interesting twist, Bobby takes the heads of several of his kills, just like a predator would to take a trophy. It would appear that predaliens are capable of inheriting more than just aspects of their hosts' bodies. The day after Bobby's rampage in the sewers, police investigators are on the scene. Detective Cooper, in his decades of service, has never seen such a horrifying sight. Two gangs ripped to shreds. The wounds indicated a variety of unknown, sharply bladed weapons were used. The most disturbing part of the scene was that multiple bodies were missing their skulls, and some their skulls and spines, as if their heads were forcibly ripped off. He could hear the others whispering that it must be some sort of large animal, but that was absurd. There was no recorded animals on Vultra capable of this. Cooper had an unwelcome thought in the back of his head. A monster must have done this. He knew it was absurd, yet the idea kept returning. They would scour the scene for prints, yet the only recent ones that came back all belonged to the victims. Normally, with no further lines of inquiry, the case would have been put on hold. However, this one wasn't, because over the coming weeks, more and more bodies began appearing around the city, with there also being a sharp increase in the number of missing person reports. You see, unlike Daniel and Barry before him, our predalien Bobby is not trying to build a nest. No, instead he is actively hunting for the queen that he can sense, while also killing any and all humans he can. While Bobby hunts, so do the predators. They are scouring the city, trying to find the abomination and slay it. They are using hacked police frequencies to try and pinpoint places Bobby has been. The city is large, however, and each time they have arrived at a discovery of Bobby's work, they find that the predalien is long gone. The Elder becomes torn on what to do. He agrees with the argument that slaying the abomination should come first, but this could take months. They still had a different mission to complete. He knows that destroying the farm is important, but his honour won't allow him to let this abomination escape. It is the middle of the night in the capital city of the planet of Vultra. Bobby the predalien stalks the streets. Sticking to the shadows, he is looking for easy prey. Soon enough, he comes across it. A lone human sitting on a bench in the park. With no other people to be seen, Bobby approaches silently from behind. Soon he is close enough and launched a single strike to eliminate his prey. However, it is not the warm, red blood he has become accustomed to that spurts out of the body. Instead, it is pure white and cold. This was no human, but an android covered in human fragrances. Suddenly, and without warning, police swarm the park, surrounding the predalien, their weapons aimed. The majority of them had handguns, but a few possessed larger, more powerful weapons that may have posed a threat to him. Instead of fighting, Bobby goes to flee, sprinting across the field as a hail of gunfire is rained down upon him. Scrambling over the park fence, He flees into the streets, pursued by police vehicles. He finds his way into the back streets, hoping to find an entrance back to the sewers, but every entrance he finds is blocked by police. Little did Bobby know that Detective Cooper had spent weeks organising this task force to bring down what he believed to be a human serial killer. Unfortunately for Cooper and everyone else in Vultra, Bobby was no human. Becoming desperate to escape, Bobby finds an air vent and crawls inside. Scurrying his way up through the office air ducts, he gains height, hoping to find somewhere he can hide until things calm down. On the top floor of the building, the office workers wander from their desks. They could hear the shots and police sirens below and were becoming worried. Suddenly, one of them receives a phone call from an unknown number. They claim to be from the government sanitation department and warns the worker that there are rats in the vents. He tells them that if they hear any sounds, they need to hit the vents as hard as they can with a broom. Soon after, a large rattling sound comes from the vents, and one of the workers gets on their desk and begins hitting it. The force of the strikes against the vent, combined with the weight of Bobby, causes the vent to collapse and the predalien to be unleashed on the office. Launching straight into the office workers, what happens next can best be described as a one-sided massacre. Those furthest away run, fleeing down the stairs. Bobby does not care if they escape. Their time will come. He is only distracted from his work by an ear-piercing sound. Looking up, he sees a helicopter. Its main weapons winding up, the aircraft releases missiles and a hail of gunfire into the floor, causing Bobby to jump out the way. Multiple office workers are caught up in the crossfire, but the pilots do not care. Once the company had realised that a previously unknown breed of Xenomorph was loose in this city, they had been carefully waiting for the perfect moment to capture it. It was one of them who had called the office pretending to be from sanitation control. To the company, these innocents are expendable. Suddenly, windows explode as armed humans rappel onto the floor. These are the company's elite specimen retrieval specialists, or ESRs for short. They are the same class of troops as those sent with the fixer to LV-289. Armed with powerful firearms and the best armour money can buy, they pose a real threat to the predalien. Sensing this, Bobby flees into the stairwell, taking down 2 ESRs on his way. After descending several floors, Bobby is shocked to feel a sharp, sudden pain as a wrist bracer stabs into his chest. Pulling himself free, he is confronted by 4 predators. They had finally caught up to the abomination, its dripping acid blood creating holes in the stairs. Bobby launches himself backwards, fleeing into another floor. Ahead of him, the helicopter spots the monster and once more opens fire on Bobby. This time, instead of fleeing, the Xenomorph charges, launching himself through the broken window onto the helicopter. The cockpit's glass does little to stop the Xenomorph's inner jaw, which bursts through, taking out the pilot. Spinning out of control, the helicopter crashes into the streets below. Both the ESR strike force and the predators pursue the Xenomorph, but lose his trail at the entrance to the sewers. Soon, both the company's elite specimen retrieval teams and the 4 predators are hunting through the sewer tunnels. No matter how deep they go, they do not find Bobby. His presence in the sewers is clear, however, told through the mutilated bodies left to rot. The Elder can feel his blood pumping through his body. It's been just over 2 months now since they landed on Vultra. 2 long months of tracking the abomination. 2 months of always just being too slow to catch it. Now they have him wounded and on the run. After several hours of sludging through the sewers, they come to a large chamber where multiple tunnels meet. Bodies and skulls laid all around. This was obviously the predalien's home. They were lucky it had not morphed into a queen or started to create a nest. This sight reinforced to the Elder that he was right to prioritise the slaying of the abomination. Its very existence could not be tolerated, and finally they would be able to eliminate it. The glory in such a hunt would be told by their ancestors. Suddenly, they are fired upon as the humans also enter the chamber. The Yautja's innate skill, active cloaking, and gadgets combined with their natural strength meant they easily outmatched the humans. Even with the humans' own elite training and weapons, they found themselves being pushed back with ease. The one advantage the humans had, however, were numbers. For every one of them the predators defeated, another would appear immediately after. In the height of this fierce battle, the predalien made its appearance. Launching from above, it slaughtered one of the predators before retreating. Bobby may have been wounded, but he recognised the opportunity to eliminate a predator and took it. As more and more humans arrived alongside riot police, the predators decided it was time to fall back and deal with the remains of their fallen. They take his body and using active camouflage, they fall back out of the tunnels. After the predators disappear, the ESR teams regroup, and leaving the local police behind, they head in the direction Bobby fled towards. They had already lost well over a dozen of their people, but that's what they are paid the big money for. The specimen was strong, but in the end, they would capture it. Of this, every single one of them was sure. Across the city, in the company's planetary headquarters, Dr. Malek is reviewing footage streamed to him by cameras worn by the ESR agents. He is the head of the company's research and development on alien creatures department. The interference of the Oucher was a surprise to be sure, a certainly unwelcome one. There had been way too many mess-ups recently. First, there was LV-289, where they lost not just a research facility, but a profitable mining operation. Then came Nocturna. The loss of their second biggest research station, alongside numerous live specimens, was scandalous and set their plans back by years. Those incidents alone were bad enough, but even worse was the fact that the survivors of both Nocturna and LV-289 had disappeared. The company's best teams were unable to locate these witnesses and eliminate them. Dr. Malek would not allow a scandal like this to happen at his facility. After all, his was the biggest and most important to the research of the Xenomorphs and other alien creatures like the Yautja. If something went wrong here, his own career would be at risk. But if he could just capture the Predator-Xenomorph hybrid alive, it would provide important research material. It would all go in his favour as well when he went for his promotion board. He had been dreaming about it for years, finally being elevated to a seat at the company's galactic headquarters on Earth. Then he could start influencing politics. After all, the company were the real political power on Earth. With his career prospects in mind, Dr. Malek decides to put all his facilities' guards on mandatory overtime, extending their shifts until this situation was over. Soon, one of the ESR teams returned, their vehicle being used to ferry the wounded back to headquarters. What they did not know, however, is that Bobby is clinging to the underside of the vehicle. He had originally hidden under the vehicle to recover from his wounds, but as it moved towards the company headquarters, he could feel the Queen's presence. She was in this building. It was time for the recovered Bobby to find her. Bobby begins crawling through the vents. He is trying to go lower, but on more than one occasion finds himself trapped by reinforced vent grills that not even his own strength can break. Whenever he comes across one of these, Bobby uses his own acid blood to dissolve a path down to the lower levels. The deeper he infiltrates, the more guards he can hear on the other side of the pipes. Instinctively, he knows this means he is getting close. He can sense the Queen, but something is wrong. The signal is immense yet unclear at the same time. He knows he is close, but does not understand what the Queen is trying to say. It is both mentally painful and frustrating. After an hour of crawling, he finds himself in a grated vent pipe. Through the slitted metal, he can see large conveyor belts, on them dozens of xenomorph eggs. This must be what they were using the Queen for, to produce eggs on an industrial scale. Bobby knew if he followed these conveyor belts he would find his way to the Queen. Not wanting to weaken himself by using too much acid blood, Bobby continued down the pipe until he dropped into a large empty room. Before the predalien even had a chance to process what is happening, the vent seals above him and all four walls and the roof become electrified. He tries to use his acid blood to escape, but finds underneath the floor is a complicated series of electrified cables. If he was to drop down through it, he would be killed instantly. The humans had captured him. On one of the highest floors of the building, Dr. Malek is laughing hysterically. His plan had worked. The Xenomorph Yautja hybrid was contained. When the facility's artificial intelligence had detected breaches in the vent system, he knew it was the alien, just as he knew it would be trying to find its queen. That made him laugh all the more. He did wonder if it knew the truth already. Had it been telepathically revealed? Did it even matter to the creature? It really took a little effort to guide the Xenomorph towards the trap. The vent system for the building secretly had hundreds of hidden walls inside it that could be deployed remotely to block paths. He had not expected the alien to use its own acid to drop down levels, but in the end, that proved to only be a minor inconvenience. The room the Xenomorph was trapped in had been designed specifically to contain a member of its species. A precaution Dr. Malek put into place when he took over the facility. Pleased with himself, he orders all ESR teams to return to the base. He will need them to go into the room manually to capture the Xenomorph, a task he would not trust to bots. What Dr. Malek doesn't know yet, however, is that at this very moment, the three Yautja are entering the facility. After losing the trail of the abomination, the Elder decided to resort to the original plan. They had the monster on the run and cornered, but the interference of these humans led not only to the prey escaping, but also the death of one of his own people. With the abomination gone to the wind, the predators will destroy the farm and all data on the Oucher before returning to their hunt. They stalk their way through the facility, slaying countless humans and taking many trophies. Their advance, however, is not smooth, as the AI system in charge of the facility's defences proves to be a challenge. It continually seals blast doors as the predators approach, and it opens others to let human and android fighters through. In almost every room, the system deploys new turrets, forcing the Oucher to use their shoulder cannons. At this rate, the predators will struggle to take down the farm before more human reinforcements arrive. Deciding to take out the problem permanently, the Oucher use their wrist braces to locate the building's power source. Battling their way through the building, they storm into the room and plant explosive devices on the generators and energy storage cells. Leaving the room, they detonate the devices, disabling the building's power supply. What they could never have realised was that this action would also free Bobby from his cage. Now that he was free from the trap, it didn't take Bobby long to find his way to the conveyor lines. Following them along, he finally comes across the truth of this facility. There was not one queen trapped to be used as a farm for eggs. No, there was 3. That was why the queen's telepathic signal had been so weird and confusing. There were 3 competing signals, all trying to be the head of the hive. It was not clear to Bobby how the company had managed to either capture 3 queens or get 3 xenomorphs to become queens. Bobby also could never have known that this is where the story began. The eggs from these queens were taken onto the conveyor belts, frozen, then sent off-world for experimentation at dozens of facilities across the outer colonies. In fact, one of these 3 queens gave birth to the egg that birthed Barry, who in turn gave birth to the egg that created Daniel, the same queen who led to Bobby being born. Stood before the 3 queens, Bobby does not hesitate. He throws himself up onto their shackles and liberates each of them. Within a matter of minutes, the facility became anarchy. The queens were smashing through walls and digging their way out. The ESR teams that were meant to stop such a scenario were already spread thin by the Oucher's attack. Those that are left are scattered and just doing their best to survive. This was the worst case scenario for Dr. Malek. Everything had just gone so wrong so quickly. Perhaps he would be able to cover it up. Maybe. At the very worst, there are other facilities. None as important as Vultra, but they could be built up. If he was to take the files with him, yes, this could work. He could explain losing a facility, but an entire planet with a population in the billions? That might be a little bit more difficult. His plans would have to be set back by a few years. But oh well, Dr. Malek was a patient man. So, in the facility control room, he activates a special console that only he had the password for. The facility's backup generators had kicked in almost immediately. However, the power was just enough to keep basic computers running and the lights on. The destruction of the primary generators and power cells meant there wasn't enough power to bring the facility's AI or defences back online. Activating the console, Dr. Malek initiates a transfer of all research data onto an advanced detachable hard drive. After several minutes, the transfer completes, and he takes the drive before preparing the console for its primary purpose, to be used in the activation of the facility's self-destruct procedure. Dr. Malek sets the timer to 10 minutes and begins typing in the passcode. As much as it pains him to see his facility destroyed, it is the only way to salvage his reputation. Before he has chance to begin the self-destruct sequence, however, the predators arrive. Panicking, he flees, leaving his ESR bodyguards to buy him time to escape on a shuttle. He never finished initiating the self-destruct sequence. If he had, what came next would have been avoided. The Predators, unaware of the copy that was made, destroy all the research data on the facility's computers. However, in the erasure of this data, they too learn the truth of the 3 queens. Down below, Bobby moves through the facility, intending to make his escape by following one of the queens. Soon, however, this queen comes across one of the other 2. At first, they stare at each other, slowly pacing uneasily. Suddenly, and without warning, they charge at each other and begin fighting. Bobby does not intervene. Instead, he stands at the side, watching intently. The fight lasted for only 2 minutes. At the end of it, one of the queens stood triumphant over its wounded fellow. Stamping its foot down, it crushed its competition, eliminating it. There could only be one matriarch. On the roof of the facility, the third queen tears a hole in the roof before climbing outside. As the cold rain hammered down against its hardened shell, the queen lets out a triumphant roar. After all this time, it was free. At the exact same moment as this, two faces very familiar with the Xenomorph threat stepped foot on Vultra for the first time. Paul and Rachel had made their way to Vultra's capital via a taxi shuttle that had flown them from the spaceport. They had both survived Nocturna, and Paul had survived LV-289 before that. In the aftermath of Nocturna, the survivors went into hiding. They knew the company would be hunting them. After all, they knew too much. They had found a small abandoned island on a half-forgotten outer colony world. The other survivors were trying to start a new life until things could go quiet enough for them to return to their homes. They were trying to move on, but Paul and Rachel couldn't. Their dreams were forever plagued with nightmares. Every time they shut their eyes, even for a second, they saw them, the Xenomorphs, the things they did. So one night they left, only leaving behind a single note. They began an investigation into the company, into where they had gotten the Xenomorph eggs from. The shuttle they had used to escape LV-289 in Nocturna had once belonged to a company fixer. Its flight manifest showed that its journey to the mining world had started from Vultra. So Paul and Rachel came to the planet, hoping to get proof of what the company had been doing before anyone else lost their lives. However, they soon realised that they were too late. The night they arrived, they see on the local news the company's planetary headquarters was being temporarily shut down following what the company called an explosion due to a pipe leak. They also heard rumours from people living in the area of a large creature fleeing the scene, its skin as black as the void of space. From the brief descriptions they got, they suspected it was a Xenomorph queen, like the one they saw in the nest on Nocturna. They had come here for proof of the company's atrocities and reckless research. Now they had a loose queen on their hands. Little did they know, they have two. After their escape, the two queens had gone in opposite directions to start their nests. Queen A, whose name is Arnold, fled deep into the sewer network, eventually finding the perfect place to start her nest. Queen B, also known as Michael, left the city entirely, setting up home in an old abandoned mining district just outside the city's borders. There are hundreds of these old mining sites all across the planet. Leftovers from Vultra's earliest days as a mining colony, before the government invested in turning it into a city world. The Predators tried following them at first, but found themselves distracted by a constant battle with ESR teams which had been shipped in from Vultra's other cities. While they would win these fights, the three Predators were all wounded. Being low on supplies, they would require time to recover before they could continue the hunt. Both of the Xenomorph queens immediately began laying eggs, and within a matter of days their hives began to grow rapidly. Queen Arnold's hive had a large human population to choose from, and his drones began kidnapping humans in the middle of the night. Queen Michael's hive, on the other hand, did not have such a large supply of humans readily available. Instead, what it did have was an impressive supply of animals, perfect to become potential hosts. And so, while Queen Arnold's hive began developing along a similar path as we've seen before, with the first bunch of warriors starting to appear, Queen Michael's hive instead had a far larger number of runner xenomorphs, and even runner warriors. Join us next time on The Life of a Xenomorph. As the two nests rapidly grow, it is inevitable that the two encounter each other. The first interaction happens on the outskirts of the city as a group of drones from Arnold's hive exit a sewer grate and come across a group of runners that have been following a potential host. At first, the two groups seem nervous around each other, unsure of how to proceed. It is a rare occasion two queens start nests so close to each other. It doesn't take long for them to follow in their mother's example and begin tearing each other apart. Thus begins an arms race of sort between the two queens, with them trying to grow their nests as fast as possible and start fielding larger and stronger casts of xenomorphs. This determination for rapid growth leads to the two nests encountering each other more and more often, as both send hunting parties into the other's territory to scout and deny their rivals access to hosts. By week 5 of the queens escaping their confinement, they are in an all-out war with each other. Police, ESR teams, and the Planetary Guard try to take out these groups of xenomorphs where they can, but find themselves massively outnumbered and struggling to track the xenomorphs back to their nests, with the xenomorphs rather throwing themselves at the enemy than be followed. As the war between the two hives rages on, the company sends ESR teams back to its former planetary headquarters. They could only spare 3 teams for this mission. The rest are required to fortify a new base for the company in case things get worse. In total, there were less than 70 ESR members left on Vultra, the rest having fallen during the battle for the planetary headquarters and the skirmishes against the predators and xenomorphs that had followed. The teams sent to the farms have clear instructions: destroy all the remaining eggs from the farm and purge any data on the electronic systems. This was as much about covering up the truth of the facility from the government as it was about denying the xenomorphs the eggs. Unfortunately, the underground section of the facility was massive, with there being thousands of eggs in storage, and only a few dozen ESR members were sent. Clearing the facility would take days. At first, it did go well. They managed to clear over half the eggs within 64 hours. Things quickly spiraled out of control, however, when a raiding party from Queen Arnold's hive arrived. A chaotic battle ensued. Once the dust settled, just over a dozen ESR members remained, having successfully beaten the xenomorphs back. Or so it seemed. In fact, this was just a distraction to allow drones to steal as many eggs as they could. While the nest didn't liberate as many as they had hoped, they still managed to get away with close to 300 eggs. It would seem that Arnold's hive might finally break the stalemate. On the 7th week after the Queen's escaped confinement, Paul and Rachel visit a homeless encampment near the centre of the capital city. They'd been hunting the trail of the xenomorphs and the company's experiments non-stop. Initially, they tried getting into the company's planetary headquarters, but were unable to sneak past patrols guarding the area. On one occasion, they barely got away without being caught. When they realised they had no chance of getting in, they started to look for sightings of the xenomorphs. They hoped to get good video evidence of them to warn the public. Unfortunately, they were always too late. Of course, the news had picked up on the increase in missing persons and reports of monsters, but the reporting suddenly stopped after only a few days. Paul and Rachel knew the company were using their immense finances to silence the story and hide their involvement, and thus their investigation had led them to this homeless camp. These rough sleepers were prime targets for the xenomorphs to kidnap. With the increase in disappearances, the homeless community had come together and formed this camp in the heart of the city for safety. Paul and Rachel's plan was to ask around and see if they could find clues of where the xenomorphs were most commonly sighted, and hopefully use that to locate a nest. They spent hours in the camp, listening to horror stories of monsters of unbreakable skin as dark as space, dragging the weak and lost into the sewers or the forest. It was clear the xenomorph's nest was growing far larger than the other two Paul had seen. As sunset came, these stories were interrupted by screaming. The xenomorphs had come. Paul couldn't believe it, attacking such a large group of people in the middle of the city. This was extreme, even for xenomorphs. Yet here they were. Rachel began screaming, telling everyone to run away, to run and hide, to no matter what they do not let them take you alive. As they run through the camp, Paul draws his pistol. Off in the distance, he sees a drone dragging a person away towards a sewer grate. Raising his weapon, he fires 3 shots. They do nothing against the xenomorph's skin. This was no military-grade rifle or company weapon designed to penetrate anything. The only weapons Paul and Rachel were able to smuggle onto Vultra were low-caliber small pistols that proved ineffective against xenomorphs. Paul locks eyes with his fellow man being dragged away. It was only for a second, but Paul could see the pure terror behind the man's eyes. He knew what awaited him in the nest. Without hesitation, Paul moved his aim and shot the man, his bullet going cleanly through the heart. Paul just stood there in shock at what he had just done. He knew it was the right thing to do. He had never taken another human life before. He only snapped back to reality when Rachel grabbed him by the arm and dragged him away. They would manage to flee alongside a small group and escape the carnage. While this was happening, the 3 predators stood in active camouflage, watching this from above. Having finally all recovered from their wounds, they continued their hunt anew, desperate to slay the abomination and 2 queens. They stalk their prey back to one of the hive entrances, an old sewer tunnel on the edge of town. Setting up camp in some nearby trees, they watch one of the entrances as drones and warriors come in and out, dragging humans inside. This hive had grown to be massive, perhaps even larger than the one on Nocturna. The Elder knew there would be multiple castes of xenomorphs, and almost certainly praetorians. The predators needed to slay the queen, not just because doing so would throw the hive into disarray, but because the skull of a queen would make a grand trophy. Despite everything that was at stake, the predators were still a proud culture and would never miss the opportunity to take a valuable prize. The Elder could tell the other two Yautja had had enough of all this sneaking about and following the trail of the abomination. This entire thing had started off as a hunting party after all, and they wanted to hunt, to be let loose. He didn't blame them. They were young and eager for glory. So be it. They would fight their way into the nest. And so their assault began. Using a mixture of cloaking and gadgets, they slaughtered their way through the winding corridors, clearing chamber after chamber of the hive. The Elder made sure they were thorough, hoping that they would find the abomination here as well. After hours of battle, they finally come close to the egg chamber. Engaging cloaking, they see the sole entrance is guarded by a Praetorian watching as drones come in and out. The Elder advises caution, to lay traps ahead of time and work together to bring the creature down. But one of the younger, more arrogant Yautja charged the Praetorian, wanting the glory for himself. He gets halfway into the chamber before he is cut down from the predalien, who launches a surprise attack from above. Standing still, warriors and drones rally around the abomination. They act differently around the predalien than others of their kind, almost as if they feel uneasy and unsure of how to treat it. Within seconds, the Elder and the other remaining Predator find themselves surrounded, with all entrances blocked by a mixture of crushers, warriors, drones, and spitters. Refusing to even consider backing down, the Predators launch into the fray, slicing Xenomorphs apart. The Elder makes a beeline straight for the Predalien. Before he can reach the abomination, a crusher smashes into his side, causing the Yautja to slam through a wall into another chamber which contained a strong stream of sewage water. Looking up, there is no sign of the Predalien, only other Xenomorphs charging in. The Elder was an incredible warrior, having slain all manner of tough foes. Despite all his strength, all his wisdom, all his skill, the Elder finds himself being pushed back by the unending hordes. Having his back to the sewage stream, he is further ambushed as Nocturmorphs leap out of the water. It is at this point the Elder accepts they cannot win here, nor can they escape. They will never be able to retrieve their fellow Predator's body and bring it to safety. They shall fight till the end, but when death greets them, they will detonate their wrist bracers and take as much of the hive with them as possible. He knows with how thick the walls behind the hive resin are, the explosion would only take out a few chambers, but it will hurt the Xenomorphs, and that alone makes it worth it. As the Elder cuts down a warrior, the predalien Bobby launches at him from the shadows. The Elder barely manages to throw the creature off. On instinct, he tries to fire his shoulder cannon, but discovers Bobby had just destroyed it in his last attack. Before he has time to process this, a Praetorian comes charging through. The Elder grapples with it, using his claws to rip away flesh. As they battle, Bobby watches from the sidelines. The Praetorian uses its tail to fling the Elder into the water. Refusing to go alone, the Praetorian digs his claws into the Xenomorph's tail, dragging it into the strong rushing water with him. As they are washed away, the other Predator finally falls after being overwhelmed by the unending hive. Before he draws his last breath, however, he detonates his wrist bracer. Something unexpected happens on the outskirts of the city. Queen Michael's hive is moving on the offensive as hundreds, if not thousands of Xenomorphs, mostly of the runner caste, move towards the city itself. Michael is using the carnage caused by the Yautja to his advantage after one of his runners named Frost had observed the Predators starting their attack. The Xenomorph's advance splits in two. Half the force enters the city, rampaging through the streets, while the other half enter the sewer tunnels to wage war on their rival nest. The local police and planetary guard forces scramble to respond, setting up choke points on the road and trying to evacuate civilians to the planet's other cities. Dr. Malek watches this unfold on monitors, but does not send any ESR teams to help, needing all of them to fortify his new base. Queen Michael's hive had grown so large solely through siphoning off the local wildlife. He had been careful to build up his numbers, preparing for an opportunity like this. In the streets, runners are used to delay human reinforcements. Scouting ahead of the main force as a vanguard, they jump on human vehicles and pick off small groups of refugees. Soon the planetary guard begin to deploy in force to the capital. They were never a strong institution. The only action they ever got was the occasional pirate vessel dealt with via boarding action. Despite their lack of experience, they still had their training and their weapons. For a time, their tactic of setting up police reinforced choke points worked in delaying the Xenomorph's advance. With support from helicopters, it looked like the humans would easily be able to withstand the Xenomorph's assault. That was, until flying Xenomorphs began appearing, literally ripping the pilots out of their vehicles, causing the aircraft to crash into the buildings and troops below. These flying xenomorphs were produced through implanting winged mammals with facehuggers. These had been Queen Michael's secret weapon, only being sent into battle once the humans deployed their aircraft. The loss of air support caused the humans to panic as the tide turned in the favour of the xenomorphs. What the humans had failed to realise, however, was that all of this was just a distraction, while the two hives fought the real battle below. From their hotel room, Paul and Rachel watch on in horror. They blamed themselves. They had failed to expose the company's lies. Of course, they were only two people. There was nothing they could have done. Paul checked his phone. Videos of the xenomorphs were uploading everywhere on the internet. Then, suddenly, the connections went out. They both knew it was the company, trying their best to cover it up or do some damage control. Secretly, Paul thought to himself that there was nothing the company could do, though. Soon, the capital would fall. Then the entire planet. With the flying xenomorphs and larger casts of aliens taking to the streets, the planetary guard forces found themselves overrun and in a complete chaotic retreat. In all the carnage, no humans noticed that Queen Michael had abandoned his nest. Instead, he is accompanied by several of his praetorians and a large contingent of warriors into the sewer tunnels that make up Queen Arnold's nest. By the time Michael arrives at the Queen's chamber, the battle was mostly over. He watches as his praetorians finish off the last of Arnold's praetorians. Queen Arnold himself lays wounded in the middle of the chamber, his legs eaten away by warriors. Michael stares down at his rival before slamming his foot through Arnold's skull. With the competition gone, Michael takes control of Arnold's nest, inheriting all of its remaining xenomorphs and the thousands of eggs. As the two hives become one, Michael sends his forces to the surface. Time has come to take over the entire planet. The Elder was flushed out the sewer system into a lake just outside of the capital. Clawing his way out, he realises that all of his technology is broken. His wrist bracer's been stuck in claws out mode. Looking up, he sees the city ahead of him, flames rising into the sky. He doesn't wait and begins his walk back towards the carnage. The coming 2 months on Vultra are pure horror. Planetary Guard and the army do what they can to hold out, but find themselves overrun at every location. It didn't take long for xenomorphs to spread to every city on the planet. The local government sent an urgent request for assistance, but any aid could take months or even years to arrive. By then it would be too late. By the end of the 2 months, only one major holdout remains, being the planetary government's headquarters. Since the Queen's escaped, Dr. Malik had moved his base of operations to the location, and had his ESR teams fortify it. Due to it being surrounded by water on 3 sides, it seemed like a prime defensive location. Now the xenomorphs had them surrounded. In the waters around them, xenomorph sharks circled, waiting for anyone foolish enough to try swimming to escape. On the other side of the bridge, thousands upon thousands of xenomorphs had been amassing. Come nightfall, they shall make their final attack. Dr. Malik watches from his new command room. He had held on to the vain belief he could salvage the situation, but now he realised he was just deluded. He had sent for a shuttle to come and evacuate him off-world. It was one of the final ones left on the planet. Little did anyone know that the Elder had infiltrated the building and was in hiding. Even without his cloaking, it was barely a challenge for the old Predator. He does not care in the least about the humans, but knows that when the final battle begins, the abomination will be among the foe. If it is the last thing he does, he will see it slain. There was no signal to the xenomorphs to begin their attack. Instead, suddenly and in unison, a wave of drones and crushers began charging across the bridge. They were being used as a shield for the warriors and spitters following in close behind. It becomes a kill zone as ESR teams and planetary guards release a hail of gunfire onto the bridge from their makeshift battlements. In the days before the battle, there had been suggestions from Dr. Malik's advisors of blowing the bridge. However, they were unable to secure enough explosives to make it happen. As all attention is focused on the bridge, hordes of Nocturmorphs rise from the sea and begin scaling the outer walls of the stronghold. Soon the battle would spread inside the facility, as the unending hordes of aliens overrun the outer defences. The main gate would be breached, and the humans would begin fighting corridor to corridor. Using makeshift traps, they attempted to slow the xenomorphs' advance, but would not be anywhere near enough. By the time Bobby the predalien begins hunting through the building, the remaining resistance has become almost non-existent. Only a few pockets remain, trying to delay the advance on Dr. Malik's position. Inside his command room, the Doctor is preparing to leave. His shuttle is en route and only a few minutes from arriving. He orders his ESR teams to prepare for them to leave, when suddenly the door blows open. They all aim their weapons at the door, but nothing happens. They realise too late it was a distraction, as Bobby drops from above and begins eliminating the ESR teams with ease. Dr. Malik does not hesitate to run. He manages to make it to the roof just as his shuttle arrives. Before he can board it, however, he watches as flying xenomorphs knock it out of the sky. Standing there in shock, he suddenly collapses. Standing behind him, Bobby delivers the finishing blow. Bobby hears a half growl, half roar, and turns around to see the elder predator stood there, ready for their ultimate duel. Neither the predator nor the predalien attack. Instead, they stand staring at each other. Finally, they would fight to the end. There was nowhere to run, no tricks to be exploited, just strength and pure martial skill. They charge at the same time and come to blows. As they battle, the rain pounds into their open wounds. The Elder is a centuries-old master of the hunt, having slain all manner of creatures over his long lifespan, while Bobby the Predalien is the ultimate combination of two of the deadliest species in the galaxy. While the Elder fights well, eventually Bobby prevails. The Elder lies wounded in a puddle of his own blood, his many wounds finally catching up to him. He had tried, given it everything he had, yet it was not enough. With his wrist bracer broken during the assault on the hive, he couldn't even self-detonate. Mustering all of his strength, he charges at Bobby, hoping to land one last strike. The Predalien uses his tail to send the Elder flying off the roof, condemning the half-dead predator to plummet into the water below. A few minutes after this, the final human in the building dies, not in battle, but afraid, hiding in a cupboard as a drone discovers them. And so, it comes to an end. After 3 long, brutal attempts that started with the birth of Barry, the Xenomorphs had finally won. There was no doubt. This planet now belonged to the Xenomorphs. In the ruins of what was once a city, a group of refugees are running for their lives. It has been 8 months since the planet they once called home has turned to hell following the fall of the last government outpost. At most, only a few small human holdouts remain, their survival depending on them being undiscovered by xenomorphs. While the heart of the nests are in Vultra's former cities, not even the countryside is safe anymore, with it being infested with endless xenomorph scouts and hunting parties. Until only an hour ago, these refugees were survivors trying to hide in an old warehouse in the industrial quarter of this city. When the planet was first being overrun, about 3 dozen of them gathered as many supplies as they could and welded themselves shut inside. They had been lucky and remained undetected by the xenomorphs. Eventually, however, their supplies ran out. They were forced to send out groups to start scavenging for food, and that was how their base was discovered, when a single drone followed one of these groups back to their home. What came next was a massacre. This small group were the only ones to make it out alive. The only option left to them now was to get to the rendezvous point. Only a few days before, they had gone in contact with another group over the radio. When the base fell, they sent out a desperate plea for aid, and this group promised to evacuate anyone who could make it to the meeting point, and so they desperately ran, being pursued by xenomorphs. It did not take long for the aliens to catch up with the group. Soon, only 2 of them remained, Luke and Laura. They carried on, Laura desperately screaming down the radio for help, but they were getting no response. Soon they were surrounded by drones and warriors. With tears in their eyes, they were prepared for the end when suddenly gunfire ripped the xenomorphs apart. Turning, they saw their saviours. Within 60 seconds, Laura and Luke find themselves shoved into a vehicle that leaves the moment everyone got on board. It takes them deep into the countryside, or at least what is left of it. Their rescuers sit in silence, not talking to or acknowledging the refugees, or even each other. The leader of the group is the one to break the silence. She introduces herself as Rachel, while she scanned them for chest bursters. Rachel informed them they would be taken to their base. When Laura asked if it was safe, she was told nowhere on this planet is safe, but their base is the closest you can get. The 2 survivors could tell their rescuers were disappointed. When they planned to meet up with this group, they had promised to share what little supplies they had left, but those were all lost in the attack. Luke was just thankful they even bothered coming to save them. After several hours of driving, they reached their destination, an old railway tunnel. Driving through the tunnel, it's like a maze, but eventually come to a dead end and stop. After a few seconds, the wall opens up, revealing a garage. Exiting the vehicle, they were escorted down a corridor, having to wait at each of the dozen bulkheads while someone opened it. Behind the final bulkhead was the atrium. Stepping inside, they were amazed to see so many people here, just going about their daily lives. Rachel hurried them along to a room that was clearly being used as a medical centre. She tells them even though they were checked earlier, they need to run a few more tests before they can get properly settled, just to be certain neither of them were infected. As soon as she left the room, Luke and Laura hugged. It seemed that they were safe here, but silently they both wondered, how long could a place like this actually go undiscovered? Paul stands in what has become his makeshift command centre. Their base had once been one of the 3,000 mines set up during Vultra's founding. When the planet positioned towards being an urban world, the facility was shut down and has been abandoned ever since. Thanks to the effort of some locals, they were able to find the facility and bring power back to it. Ever since, they had been continually fortifying their new home. The only other person in the room was Davis, sat at his computer. Being an android, Davis remained in the room 24/7, monitoring for any breaches or issues of the power or water supply. Paul was truly thankful to have him by his side. Davis tells Paul that Rachel's squad had returned. However, only 2 survivors had been saved, and all the promised supplies had been lost. Thanking Davis, Paul returns to reading his daily supply report. To say things were grim would be an understatement. They were low on food, water, medicine, even ammo. They really needed the supplies from the group Rachel went for. They had 236 people here now. Among their number were less than 2 dozen survivors from the planet's defense force and police, but most of them were either too wounded or traumatized to help. In fact, they only had a few dozen people who were both capable and willing of fighting xenomorphs. These people were split up into several teams and sent out to gather supplies. These missions were dangerous, often requiring them to go into the heart of xenomorph territory. Morale among these troops was at an all-time low. Recently, they lost an entire squad on a routine supply mission. To make matters worse, every day more and more runners began patrolling closer to their base. Then there were the rumours of a tall humanoid creature battling the xenomorphs. People looked to him and Rachel for what to do next. The teams demanded they didn't both leave on scavenging parties at the same time in case one of them died, so they took it in turns to lead teams into xenomorph territory. He knew how ridiculous it was. He was no leader. When the xenomorph takeover began, they got out as many people as they could and found this place. Because they dealt with the xenomorphs before, people assumed they knew what they were doing. In reality, they were just doing their best to keep people alive for as long as possible. Paul thought to himself he was no leader. He was just a scared man who had been lucky. Rachel joins Paul in the control room and explains the situation, that when they were close, the group sent an SOS that their base had been compromised. Despite her best efforts, they only managed to save 2 of the group. They stand there in silence for several seconds, both knowing that something truly drastic was needed. It was Paul who said what they were both thinking. There was a planetary supply depot just outside of the nearest city, but still deep in xenomorph territory. It had been overrun early in the war, before the vast majority of its supplies could have been ferried off-world or to any of the holdouts. They had been debating going for weeks now, but the extremely high xenomorph activity in the area had always posed too far a risk. In theory, there could be enough supplies to get them through the next few months, maybe even half a year, but that wasn't a certainty. For all they knew, the supplies could have been destroyed in the chaos, already scavenged before the government fell. Whenever they went near or into the cities, they used hit-and-run tactics, never staying in one place for long to prevent the hive from bringing too many xenomorphs against them. For this, however, they would have to stay there long enough to load up the supplies before leaving. That was why they had never gone for it before. While they took risks every time they left the base, the chance of something going wrong was far too high. Now, however, things were different. If they didn't go, they would probably run out of food. Paul makes the decision that despite the risks, come the morning he will take his team and go to the facility. Deeper in the base, Luke and Laura are introduced to where they will be sleeping. A large room with dozens of beds crammed inside. Despite the situation and the cramped environment, they are welcomed with open arms. After all, tragedy makes everyone equal. In the early hours of the morning, Rachel visits Paul in his room. He had taken to sleeping in what had once been a storage cupboard, simply because it was close to the command centre in case of an emergency. Ever since moving to this facility, they rarely got to spend any time together alone. There was always some meeting or expedition for supplies that one of them needed to go on. From the time they escaped Nocturna, the two had grown close and come to take comfort in each other's company. They made a good team. which was a large part in why they had gotten this far. Both of them pretended that they knew what they were doing, putting on a confident facade around others. It was only when they were alone that they could show their true weaknesses to each other. Paul was always glad when it was his turn to go on the expeditions, because it meant that he knew the survivors of this space would be safe under Rachel's leadership if anything happened to him. They remain together until it is time to leave. Paul makes his way to the garage. Waiting for him is his team of 6 people. Shepard, the old retired colonial marine who had seen more of his fair share of battle. Smithy and Reynolds, who had both once been police from different cities, never having met before the alien invasion. Gunnar, a former member of the Planetary Guard. And then there were the 2 civilian volunteers, Dipper and Oswald. For the expedition, they would take 2 vehicles. Shepard, Dipper and Reynolds would take one of their old beat-up armoured vehicles, while Paul would go with the rest in a transport truck. As the sun began to rise, their vehicles left the compound, off towards the unknown. It took the convoy 3 hours to arrive at their location. During their journey, they passed many Xenomorph runners and drones. Upon arrival, the armoured vehicle stopped first, their team leaping out of the vehicle to clear the area as to allow the less armoured truck to park without issue. There was a decent amount of Xenomorph activity, but nowhere near the level Paul was expecting. Once the area was secure, the group prepared to enter the facility. Paul made the decision that Oswald was to hide and watch the vehicles. His job was to radio if he saw anything, so that if the group were to end up being flanked, they would at least get a warning about it. This expedition made it the team's 32nd mission. Once they had numbered almost double what they do now, but that was true of every team at the base. Every member of Paul's team knew what they were doing, even those who had little or no combat experience. Not that it would matter in the face of a Xenomorph. Entering the facility, the team were met with a grim scene. It was immediately clear that the Planetary Guard and police had attempted to defend this warehouse. Paul never would have said it aloud, but he did think to himself that those who had fallen here were the lucky ones. His mood only became worse when they realised the backup generators had either not kicked in or had been destroyed in the battle. All of the perishable foods would have been worthless. The big question that remained, however, was how much of the non-perishable food was actually left. The team began clearing the facility room by room, checking every single corner and dark vent. In their experience, seemingly abandoned buildings were often home to Xenomorphs laying in wait to ambush them. They had all lost too many good friends that way. The Xenomorphs were certainly cunning creatures. As they moved through the facility, the team only came across a few drones and runners, but nothing major. This was nowhere near as bad as they thought it would be, which made Paul nervous, terrified even. Little did Paul know that his feelings were justified, as in the shadows, a strong threat had been watching them. In the site manager's office, they blew apart a lone Xenomorph runner. Quickly, they take to checking all the documents in the room. This allows them to discover a printout of a manifest dated to the day before the facility was overrun, detailing the resources the facility had. It looked like most of them had already been moved before the facility fell, but several dozen crates of tinned food had been left in the West Wing. They had been due to be shipped the day after the facility fell, so it seemed reasonable they would still be there. The amount of crates left gave Paul a sense of hope he had not felt in a long time. With proper rationing, that amount of food could keep them going for months. Paul takes his radio out and calls to Oswald to let him know the good news. Oswald radios back, telling Paul everything is fine here and there are no sign of any Xenomorphs. Unfortunately, Oswald was wrong, something he only discovered in the second after finishing his conversation with Paul. Paul's group fight their way to the west wing of the facility, clearing the small groups of Xenomorphs as they go. Once they got access to the west wing, they found exactly what they were looking for. Paul had not felt relieved like this in longer than he could remember. To make matters even better, there was a working forklift, which was useful because Dipper had the greatest skill of all, a forklift certification. Loading the crates onto the forklift, they began to drive back to their vehicles. It would take at least another 2 trips to get everything loaded up. As soon as they got back outside, Reynolds went to tell Oswald the good news, while the others helped load the supplies onto the truck. When Reynolds got to what had been Oswald's hiding place, he saw his comrade on the floor, a large hole gaping through his chest. Before Reynolds could warn the others, a heap of acid from a Xenomorph spitter hits him in the centre of his face, melting the flesh away. Soon, the group are set upon by Xenomorphs, seemingly appearing from every angle. The group quickly moved to take defensive positions, just in time for the first runners to get close. Not far away, a group of Crushers were quickly approaching them, while Spitters fired acid haphazardly in their direction. Despite every instinct in his body telling him to retreat, Paul refuses to abandon the rest of the supplies in the West Wing. Instead, he tells everyone to get into the vehicles as he begins driving the armoured one. Shouting obscenities, he without hesitation smashes the vehicle through the West Wing's wall. Scrambling out of their vehicles, the remaining members of the group quickly begin loading up the truck. They all knew they had to be quick. Time was not on their side. It only took a few minutes for the first runners to arrive. Barking orders, Paul led Gunnar and Shepard in holding the aliens off while Dipper and Smithy loaded the vehicle. Soon, runner-warrior hybrids began to enter the building. The group barely take them down before the Xenomorphs get within striking distance. Just when they think they can take a break, a crusher enters the fray. Panicking, they all begin firing at the crusher, the shots bouncing off its hard carapace head. The monster charges at Shepard, who barely manages to roll out the way. The crusher couldn't have come at a worse time. They were almost done loading the vehicle. In desperation, Gunnar releases a hail of gunfire, drawing its attention. With the Xenomorph distracted, Paul leaps into the armoured vehicle and reverses it at full speed into the crusher, hitting its side and trapping it against the wall. It was so satisfying that Paul did it again, causing the crusher to wail in pain. When Paul tried to do it a third time, the alien used its head to knock the armoured vehicle and free itself. Before the wounded creature could make another move, Shepard threw a grenade under the crusher that detonated, taking out its legs and finishing their enemy. At the same time, Dipper finished loading the last crate onto the truck and got into the vehicle alongside Gunnar. Shepard climbed into the armoured vehicle, Smithy right behind him, but as Smithy steps foot in the vehicle, a spitter hits him in the back of the head, its acid horrifically burning through his skull. Shooting the spitter to pieces, Shepard drags Smithy's lifeless body inside the vehicle as it drives off. Looking out the wind mirror, Paul can see the hordes of Xenomorphs descending on the West Wing. The drive back to the base was silent and sour. They had gotten the supplies they so desperately needed, but at the cost of Reynolds, Oswald and Smithy. Losing even one member of the team was a rough blow for morale, and all three of them would be sorely missed. Paul wondered if this is how it would end for them, being picked off one by one over the course of months until none remained to fight back against the Xenomorphs. Once the group was sure they had driven far enough away that the Xenomorphs couldn't follow them, the vehicles returned to their base. Driving through the security, they were greeted by Rachel and several members of other expedition groups, including Detective Cooper. Following the revelation that the serial killer he was chasing was in fact an alien creature, the detective had thrown himself into finding out more about the aliens. When the cities had begun to fall, he too had done what he could to get as many civilians out as possible. As they unload the supplies and leave the garage, a surprise visitor reveals himself. It would appear the ever-cunning Bobby the predalien had been hiding on the underside of the vehicle this whole time. Luke and Laura were in the main atrium when Paul's team returned with the supplies. Immediately there was near uncontainable excitement from everyone. Apparently food had been a big issue here for months now, and these supplies would be a massive help to everyone. The two survivors were still getting used to seeing so many people, and had not yet truly felt settled in this place. Ever eager to earn their place, they volunteer to carry the supplies to the storage room. Paul gladly accepts their help and asks to talk to Rachel alone. The two of them go to Paul's small room. He tells Rachel everything about the mission, about how it was going so well, only to turn catastrophically wrong. She knows it has upset Paul, that he's fed up barely holding on. He asks her how long they can actually keep doing this, surviving day to day, watching their friends get ripped to pieces. It's not as if any of them will ever get off this world, it's just a matter of how long. Rachel tells him there is still hope. Either someone will come with a ship, or eventually they will find one that still works. Paul doesn't know if Rachel actually believes that. Regardless, he is grateful for her company. Come the morning, she will be going out with her own team to see if they can scavenge some more vehicles, or even parts from a factory far away. It will be at least 4 days until he sees her again. First thing in the morning after Rachel's group left for their expedition, Paul returned to his duties. His main objective for the day was to make a plan with Davis for food rationing. Later that same day, Luke and Laura were loading the last of the supplies into the storage room. The base was like a maze, and on their way back, they found themselves lost in a room filled with old machinery. It was Luke who saw it first, a freshly defeated body laying on the ground. Screaming, they ran out of the room and found the first group of fighters they could find. The group quickly piled into the room and began to search it. Just as they had become confident there was no threat in the room, they did a head count and realised that one of them was missing. Alarms are raised all across the facility. The humans were certain this was the work of a xenomorph, but the question was, how many are there? Paul is quickly alerted to the situation and begins coordinating the hunt. He sends Detective Cooper and a group of 5 others to search the uppermost floors of the facility. Specifically, they were checking the old elevator shafts in case any xenomorphs were using them to quickly move between levels. Using flashlights, they checked each one, but found no sign of alien life. Suddenly they hear gunfire nearby and run to find the source. Entering the old flyer loading bay turned fuel storage room, they find several bodies scattered around. Watching every shadow, the group begins searching. This room only had one way in and one way out, so they were certain there was at least one xenomorph in the room with them. Cooper can tell the others in the group are terrified. They had all fought the xenomorphs across countless missions since the planet fell, but the idea of a xenomorph in their new home was horrifying. Suddenly, Bobby the predalien reveals himself by dropping a body from above. Before anyone can process what happened, one of them is being torn apart. Panic sets in across the group just as Bobby turns to charge at Detective Cooper and another survivor. This other fighter raises his weapon. Cooper screams trying to stop him but is ignored as the person fires. The bullets flying past are dodging Bobby and hitting the fuel cans behind. A large explosion sends them flying back as the sealed gate next to where the canisters stood is blown off its hinges, opening a large hole into the base. Bobby's hardened skin helped him survive the brunt of the explosion, only slightly injured, truly showing what the combined resistance of the Yautja and the Xenomorph can endure. A wounded Detective Cooper looks up just in time to see the predalien's claws darting towards him, as Bobby claims the detective's head as a prize. Paul could feel the explosion. It was as if the entire facility had shook. Davies informs him that power had gone out into the fuel storage room, making it impossible for him to connect to any devices in that part of the facility. They had also lost contact with Cooper and his team. With anxiety clawing its way into him, Paul sends Shepard to investigate what had happened. Several minutes later, Shepard enters the room, which was slowly being devoured by fire. Shepard stands over the headless body of Cooper and looks around the room to see the rest of the team had been ripped apart, some by the explosion, others by a xenomorph. Although, in most cases, it was hard to tell which was which. Shepard then walks around the flames and stares out at the newly opened hole in the wall. He tells Paul they're in trouble as he sees a horde of xenomorphs approaching through the forest, clearly drawn by the explosion. Paul throws his head into his hands as he realises the situation he is now faced with. By Davis's estimation, the first of the xenomorph runners will be inside the base within 5 minutes. Even if they fight, the hive knows where they are now and will keep sending aliens until they are overrun. All of the survivors had prepared for this day, though they hoped it would never come. Paul always knew it would, though. He orders a full evacuation of the facility. Anyone who managed to escape was to rendezvous in 12 hours at a designated spot. Where they would go from there, Paul did not know. They had never located anywhere that would be safe enough to be a new base. To evacuate, everyone would have to make their way to the vehicle bay, but it was going to take far longer than 5 minutes to get everyone out. Then there was also the fact that they needed to move the supplies as well. If they didn't, they would all starve sooner before later, but that would take even more time that they did not have. There was a real possibility that the xenomorphs would overrun them before they were ready to go. The truth was simple. They didn't have enough fighters and Paul knew it. They needed Rachel's team back. He considered not telling her. It would take her just over an hour to return to the base, but he wasn't sure if she would survive the carnage. No matter what happens, he just wants her to live. But no, he can't let his own feelings for her change the fact that hundreds of people might not survive. He needs her team, so Paul tells Davis to send her a message and recall her to the base. Luke and Laura find themselves running in a crowd of around a dozen other people. The atmosphere is pure chaos. Everyone is desperately trying to escape before the xenomorphs arrive. Nearby, someone has stood atop a crate. Laura thinks his name is Gunnar. He is screaming at the group, telling them they need people to help carry the supplies or they will all starve. No one is listening. They are too scared and focused on their own survival to care. Rushing over, Luke and Laura volunteer to help. Gunnar tells them to follow him and they make their way to the supply room, which is only a few rooms away from the breach in the base. As they get close, a handful of men and women run past them, charging towards the fuel storage room where the hole was. Inside the supply room, Dipper is waiting for them on a forklift. They load up as many supplies as it can hold. It still would not be enough for everyone and they would need to make multiple journeys. As they exit the room, they hear another much smaller explosion nearby. Turning, they see the first xenomorphs pouring out the fuel storage room into the corridor. Some of the remaining fighters in the corridor break and flee, while others stand and fight. In this horde of xenomorphs, the alien runner called Frostwatches. Showing his intelligence, instead of following the crowd into the battle, he instead goes another way, taking the elevator shaft lower into the facility, where less protected targets await. Back in the corridor, a drone leaps towards Luke and Laura, but is blown apart in midair. Turning, they see Shepard wearing a large grin on his face, ready to fight until the end. The old colonial marine tells the others to run, for he will buy as much time as possible. Gunnar tries to argue with him and convince his friend to come with them, but Shepard refuses, saying he will meet them at the evac point. He knows how to handle himself after all. Reluctantly, Gunnar leads the others away. As they turn the corner, they hear the shots from Gunnar's weapon ring down the corridor. The Xenomorphs quickly spread to every level. There was nothing left they could do from the command room, so Paul and Davis go to join the fight. The human and android both prepared to trade their lives to buy time for others to escape. As they walk down twisting corridors, Paul asks Davis if he is afraid. He tells him as an android he feels no fear, but if he was capable of such emotion, he would most certainly be afraid. It doesn't take the pair long to find their first Xenomorphs. After a short battle, they find themselves on a catwalk above the main atrium. Below them, the room was consumed with flames. The fire from the upper levels couldn't have spread this far. Clearly, someone had tried to use a flamethrower against the aliens. While they were effective in tight spaces and would make a single drone flee, they wouldn't scare big groups who would simply run through the flames. Paul was snapped out of looking below as a warrior charged at him. With no choice, Paul shot at it. The acid blood of the creature rained on the gantry, causing it to give way. Paul tried to hold on, but as the floor gave, he fell into the room below. Rachel's vehicle is rushing back to the base. The message they received from Davis was simple. The base had been compromised and they were needed back to help in the defense. Rachel's team had sent multiple messages in reply since then, but not one of them had been answered. As they got close to the base, they could see the flames coming from it and thousands of Xenomorphs off in the distance advancing on the location. Rachel's heart sank, and all she could wonder is who was left. On the hard floor of the atrium, Paul lies, injured from his fall. Davis had fallen down too, though he had ended up on the other side of the room battling with a drone. He defeats it just as a crusher rips him in half, his upper body rolling aside. Wounded, Paul raises his pistol at the alien as it slowly approaches him. He fires once, then twice. Then on the third squeeze of the trigger, instead of a gunshot, he is met with a clicking sound. It was over. This is where his story ended. All he could think was sorry. Sorry, Rachel. You'll have to go on alone. He prepares for the end as the crusher charges at him. Paul blinks and the crusher falls to the ground. Stood between them was a giant humanoid creature. This was the Elder Predator. The ancient Yautja slowly turns around to face Paul. The Elder's defeat at the hand of the abomination should have killed him. When he plummeted into the water, he found himself attacked by xenomorph sharks. It took great effort, but he managed to fight his way out. Half dead, he clawed his way onto the shore and eventually found rest in a sealable compartment of a human shop. He passed out and awoke days later. The power had gone out, and he had to physically rip the door off. It took months for the wounded Yautja to recover. He moved into the countryside, constantly avoiding xenomorph patrols, waiting to build his strength back up. But it was his spirit that was wounded the most, for he had failed. The greatest moment of his life, and he had failed. The shame consumed him. Once he healed, he began a campaign of destruction against the xenomorphs. Striking at patrols randomly, he would defeat them, then withdraw. On occasion, he saved humans. Not out of any sense of morality, but for respect of fellow warriors battling against an unending foe. Recently, he observed a group of humans at a storage unit. He followed their trail back to this base. He had planned to observe them to judge their strength, but then this happened. Now, before him was this puny human, and the Elder debated what to do. He makes his decision and approaches the clearly terrified human. He reaches out a hand. From his observations of humans, he believed this was a sign of trust. It took Paul a few seconds, but eventually he took it and was helped back onto his feet. Paul was uneasy. He had seen this kind of creature before in Nocturna. One of them had slaughtered several of his friends. Then he saw more later, battling with the Nocturna hive's queen and her guards. The creature tapped its chest several times while shaking its head left and right. Then it pointed its metal claws at the crusher and nodded. Paul understood the message all right. This creature was not his enemy. Only the Xenomorphs were. In that moment, 3 more Xenomorphs began to appear, slowly edging along the corners of the room. The Elder stepped forward. The first of these aliens bolted at the Predator and he cut it in half. One more leaped at the Oucher and began grappling with him while the third charged for Paul. Paul saw a body with a gun nearby. He dived towards it, picking up the rifle and shot down the warrior. The Elder threw the other Xenomorph away, giving Paul the opportunity to blow it apart. The door to the atrium is pried open as Gunnar, Dipper, Luke and Laura arrive. They are horrified at the sight of the Elder, and Gunnar raises his weapon, but Paul tells him it's okay. This thing is on their side, for there is only 2 sides, the Xenomorphs and everything else. Gunnar tells Paul about how Shepard had stayed behind. It was clear he almost certainly wouldn't have survived, although no one said it. They began discussing what to do. They had enough supplies to last another week or 2, but ideally they needed more. They were going to need to do another supply run, but the place is swarming with Xenomorphs. The Predator, being uninterested, begins to walk off. Paul shouts at the Oucher, who, using the acid blood from a Xenomorph's finger, writes the word hunt on the floor. Paul nods reluctantly, knowing he has no way to make the creature stay, and the ancient hunter leaves. An alarm goes off over one of the doors. This alarm had a very specific purpose. It meant there were Xenomorphs in the vehicle bay where everyone should have fled to. Expecting the worst, Paul tells Dipper that the 2 of them will go back up into the Xenomorph-infested floors to get another round of supplies. Everyone else is to go on to clear the vehicle bay and then load the supplies they'd already collected onto the vehicles. Both directions will be dangerous, and the chance of success would be low, but there was nothing else they could do. They needed the supplies, and if Xenomorphs had gotten into the vehicle bay, there still could be civilians trapped in there with the aliens. They couldn't just abandon them. Before leaving, Paul went over to Davis. Even with his lower half missing, the android was still working. Paul propped his friend onto a crate and promised they'd grab him when they came back through with the supplies. Less than 10 minutes later, Rachel's team arrived to find all the doors to the base already open. Clearly, people tried exiting in a panic and were found by the Xenomorphs. From the looks of it, no one who had tried to escape had made it out alive. As they enter the vehicle bay, they find Xenomorphs everywhere and quickly begin battling them. The aliens would pose little threat to the group, as within seconds of the fight starting, Gunnar, Luke and Laura came up behind the Xenomorphs and began shooting them from behind. Reuniting with Gunnar, Rachel asks what the situation is, and counting the vehicles, she works out that all of them were accounted for. This meant that not a single person had escaped to the Xenomorph ambush. Gunnar gave a brief rundown that the facility had been overrun following a large explosion. Immediately, Rachel asked where Paul was, and Gunnar's face turned into a grim sight as he told her he'd gone back deeper into the base. Paul and Dipper exit the elevator back onto the upper levels. Within seconds, they find themselves set upon by Xenomorphs. Battling down the corridor, they hear gunshots not far away. As they turn the corner, they see Shepard standing in front of a long line of defeated aliens. It seemed the old man still had his tricks. The 3 of them agree that they will finish just one last supply run. With the rate the flames were consuming the base, it seemed impossible they would get the chance for a third. Entering the storage room, they find it being engulfed by flames. Quickly, the 3 men start grabbing what supplies they could and load it onto the forklift. On their way back to the elevator, they come to a junction and stop as a Xenomorph warrior is flung backwards. A second later, the Elder walks up to it and takes its head. More aliens begin approaching the Predator, who simply charges at them and begins his slaughter. The humans use this opportunity to their advantage and run in the direction of the elevator. Running into the elevator, they select the button for the atrium. Looking out as the doors prepare to close, Paul sees the Elder struggling as 6 warriors attack him from both sides and begin dragging him around. Paul feels as if time itself was slowing down. Swearing louder than he ever had in his life, he bolts out the elevator just as the doors close. Even as his body moved, he wasn't sure why he was doing it. He didn't know this creature, and its kind had taken out multiple of his friends on Nocturna, and yet he felt compelled to help. After all, it had saved his life from the Crusher. Getting closer, Paul guns down 3 of the Xenomorphs. The Elder lodges its claws into another's head before slicing a second in half, and with the same swing, slamming his claws into the third's heart. With the warriors defeated, the Elder turns and stares at Paul. Despite the risk to his own life, this human had come to help him. In the Elder's experience, the vast majority of humans were cowardly and easily broken creatures. This one was clearly one of the exceptions. The Elder thinks that perhaps he needs to change his tactics and work with these humans to take down the abomination. They were not of his clan, but clearly this human was honourable, and that was enough for him. The Elder gestures ahead, and the 2 of them walk side by side back to the elevator. They feel the ground rumble under their feet. The fire had destroyed several of the support beams on the upper floors. The entire facility was literally beginning to fall down around them. As they wait at the doors, the Elder hears it. A sound, a single scuffle among the crashing of the base's demise. Pushing Paul out the way, the Elder dodges just in time as Bobby the predalien falls in front of them. The Elder immediately starts battling the abomination. He is filled with excitement, but tries to temper his emotion as to not let it control him. Paul raises his rifle and fires, but in the same instant the predalien dodges while knocking the Elder towards the shots. Paul throws his gun wildly, barely missing the Predator, but as he does so his gun runs out of ammo. Bobby then uses his tail and knocks the Elder to the floor. Leaping forward, he goes to finish his prey, but is knocked aside when Paul uses his rifle as a club and smashes it into Bobby's head. The Elder strikes out at Bobby, forcing the predalien to leap backwards. Suddenly, the doors of the elevator open and Rachel comes charging out alongside Shepard and Gunnar. Without hesitation, the three begin firing at Bobby, who turns and flees. All the humans in the Elder pursue the abomination into a burning room. As they enter, they see Bobby climbing the wall as he leaps through a hole in the roof, opened up by the base's collapse. Having watched his ultimate prey escape once more, the Elder roars in frustration. The group have no time to wallow in their anger. The collapse of the base is escalating with every second. It won't be long until the entire building collapses on top of them. They run as fast as they can to the vehicle bay. Even the Elder comes along, clearly moving at a slower pace to keep up with the humans. Climbing inside two vehicles, they drive out of the base, knocking Xenomorphs aside as they went. 12 hours later, they come to the rendezvous point as procedure dictated, but there was no one there. Clearly, they were the only ones to survive the base's fall. As the sun begins to set on this day of hells, Paul falls to his knees and cries. He had failed to protect his people and felt the burden of that with all he was. Everyone was left with a single question: what now? War to retake the planet of Vultra has begun. A strike force of Marines have been deployed by dropship to the planet's surface. These are some of the finest warriors in the galaxy, expert killers of hostile alien life. After initial landing, they set up a forward operating base in a town several miles from the former capital city of the planet. But not everything has gone smoothly. During their descent, several of their dropships were taken down by Xenomorph flyers. One of these ships has crashed just outside one of the planet's other cities. The survivors have been pinned in place as drones charge them while spitters prevent them from leaving their position. Soon, warriors begin to appear. Despite being wounded from the crash and only 5 of them being left, these Marines hold out far longer than they should have. Their defiance would soon be brought to an end, however, as a Crusher arrives. The Marines do what they can, but are unable to get an angle on the Crusher to wound it. As it charges them, they prepare for the end. However, suddenly the creature is struck off its course as the Elder Predator launches at it. At the same moment, humans begin to appear from its flanks and blow holes in the Xenomorph's sides. Trapped between the Marines and the new arrivals, the aliens are quickly dealt with. The Marines are nervous of their new saviours, especially the Predator. In their briefing, they were told that the chances of survivors were next to none, but if there were any, they would be in hiding, not fighting out in the open. Yet here were a group of humans clearly very experienced in fighting the Xenomorphs. A member of this mysterious group introduced himself as Paul and asked the Marines what they were doing. The Marine Sergeant Averson stepped forward and explained they were part of a large vanguard operation to secure key landing zones in preparation for a Liberation fleet to retake the planet. As the sergeant spoke, Paul burst out in dry laughter. It was the first time he had laughed in longer than he could remember, but it was just so absurd. Paul tells them there is no retaking the planet. It belongs to the Xenomorphs now. Sergeant Averson wasn't exactly impressed by Paul's response, but he told the survivors that their base should have been set up by now. However, their comms were damaged in the crash, so they can't check or call for backup. He promises the group that he will protect them when they make it there, and will arrange for all of them to get passage off-world, even their unusually tall friend. Paul takes his group aside and speaks to them in private. It's been 3 months since the fall of their base. They had run out of fuel and abandoned their vehicles less than a week after the incident. Since then, they had been desperately looking for somewhere to take as a new base, but this revelation of the Marines changed everything. Before making any agreements, Paul asks the others what they thought. He then approached the sergeant and told him they would go with the Marines. No one said it, but it was clear they would be protecting the wounded Marines as much as the Marines would be protecting them. Paul warns them it will be dangerous. The base is over a day's walk away, and it means going deep through Xenomorph territory that he can't promise they will all survive. In theory, they could go around it, but it would take months, and the survivors want to get off this world as soon as possible. Their journey takes them through heavily infested areas. The hive's corruption has spread across the world, changing the very Earth into an extension of the Queen's nest. The group moves carefully, doing their best to avoid drawing attention to themselves. The Elder separates himself from the group, scouting ahead. He's rarely seen, only appearing in brief moments to draw the locations of Xenomorphs ahead into the ground. Paul still didn't want to trust the Predator. After all, one of its kind killed several of his group on Nocturna, but he does not have the luxury of being picky of his allies. They continue moving through half-destroyed buildings. In the streets outside, a Crusher patrols alongside a pack of runner drones. One of the Marines asks his sergeant if they should ambush them, but Paul interrupts, explaining that they'll all die if they do. It took them over 24 hours, but soon they come to the border of what had once been a residential part of this city. Another hour, and they will be at the base. There was even heavier Xenomorph activity in the streets here, so the group stuck to the ruined buildings as they moved. The hive was even more active than usual, clearly offset by the presence of the Marine force. As they continued their journey, Paul had grown ever increasingly concerned by how trigger-happy the Marines seemed. All it would take was one shot, and they would have an endless horde of Xenomorphs descend upon them. The last few months had been rough. They were all hungry and tired, and Paul wasn't sure if the people had it in them for another long, sustained battle. The decision was taken out of his hands when one of the Marines opened a door and was met by a runner on the other side of it. The alien sliced into the Marine, eliminating him just as another Marine fired into the alien. There was a brief moment of shocked silence before Paul shouted a single command: "Run." Within 10 seconds, they are set upon by Xenomorphs. They begin a running battle, shooting down the aliens as they desperately try to escape. There were casualties. 2 more of the already wounded Marines died within the first minute. As the warrior dived at Rachel from behind, the Elder slammed at his side and ripped it in half with his claws. One of Rachel's team got hit with an acid blast from a spitter, melting them apart, while another got dragged down and finished by a runner. Paul couldn't believe it. After everything they had been through, was this really how it would end? These thoughts were blasted out of his head as suddenly gunfire erupted from the direction they were running towards as armoured personnel carriers barreled down the street towards them. As they got close, they ground to a halt and disgorged their squads of Marines who formed a defensive position, providing valuable cover for the survivors to get to them. Looking back, they saw hordes of Xenomorphs converging on their position. One of the Marines told Sergeant Averson to continue to the base. They would hold the line and clear the street. Paul wondered to himself if that was possible, but he couldn't deny the firepower the Marines had brought with them was effective. Leaving the Marines behind, the survivors continued their journey. Within an hour, they could see the base close by. There were turrets everywhere with thick, reinforced walls and long lines of sight. It was impressive, but Paul knew even with all of this, the base would not hold forever against the weight of a Xenomorph horde. As they began their final approach to the base, the Elder stayed behind, hiding in the shadows. Everyone knew that bringing him at this point would only cause trouble and be used against them. Paul would bring up the Elder and their arrangement when the time was right. As they got close to the base, a team of Marines came sallying out of the gate and detained the entire group, even Sergeant Averson and his remaining Marines, and they were all brought to separate holding cells within the base. After several in-depth scans and waiting a few hours just to be safe, everyone except Sergeant Averson and his Marines were rounded up and brought to a large room together. Inside, they are greeted by a man in clean military dress. He introduces himself as General Mustang, the commanding officer of this operation. Mustang explains to the group they'd been sent here to establish a forward operating base that could be used as a staging point when the rest of the Liberation fleet arrives to retake the planet. Without giving him time to explain any more, Paul interrupts and tells them they need to leave, to abandon this planet and blow it apart from orbit until nothing living remains. Unsurprisingly, the General refuses, telling Paul they currently have androids digging trenches and marine teams are preparing to demolish the surrounding buildings to open up even more lines of sight. Paul tries explaining that it won't work. The Xenomorphs are not like any enemy that they have faced before. The General brushes this off, but promises that he will honour Sergeant Averson's promise and any of the group who want to leave are free to do so, and will be given safe passage to wherever they want. However, the General also offers them to stay as advisors. After all, they had survived for so long that surely they knew a thing or two about how the Xenomorphs operated. He promised them great financial rewards if they did, knowing they would need time to consider. The General says to take the evening, but before they leave, someone else has a few questions for them. At that moment, a man in a suit walked in, with the General introducing him as William Zulan, an executive for the company. Upon hearing the man's job title, Paul went berserk, screaming how they cannot be here. He promises the General to explain it all, but he tells him that the company cannot be trusted. It's all their fault, them and their endless greed. The executive seemed taken aback at first by Paul's tirade, then his face twisted into one of morbid curiosity. General Mustang tried explaining that the executive was here only as an advisor. After all, the company had set up the initial colony, and still retained many of the plans to the planet, and he was only here to help. Seeing that this did little to calm Paul, the General suggested that the group go to their new quarters and take until the morning to decide on his proposition. When they got to their quarters, the first thing they all did was showered and had their clothes cleaned. It all felt so strange to Paul, like a fever dream. He had grown so used to the smell, it was uneasy not having it anymore, and actually being clean. While they showered, Davis was taken away for repairs. The improvised legs he had been walking on since the base's fall had been made by Dipper following Davis's instruction. They served their purpose, but were rudimentary, and the marine engineers would upgrade them back to their full functionality. That night, they all sat in the room and discussed what they wanted to do. Paul told the rest of them they should all leave, but that he was going to stay. The company was here, and Paul was certain they would want to retrieve specimens, or had some other grand scheme in mind. So he couldn't leave. He needed to stay behind and find a way to deny the company their prize, or this would all just start over again. Rachel was the first to say that she would stay too. Then it was Shepard and Gunnar, soon all of them. Even Luke and Laura, who arguably had the least experience fighting and the most reason to leave. It wasn't that they wanted to. They all wanted to leave and escape this nightmare, but they couldn't, because Paul was right. They had to stop the company from retrieving any Xenomorphs. If they failed, the consequences would be disastrous. Come the morning, the group tell General Mustang their decision. He's pleased by their choice and tells them he's already got advisory assignments for them all. They are split into smaller groups and spread across the base to give advice on defence and procedures. Paul and Shepard are brought to the base's command centre. It was a million times better than the makeshift one Paul had at their old base. As they enter, the company executive is stood next to a central command console. Paul stares him down as they approach it. The General explains that to prepare for a full invasion to liberate the planet, they need to secure several key locations. The first is the planetary spaceport, which is needed to allow easy docking for their ships. The second is a nuclear reactor power plant to bring the spaceport back online. The third location is a government facility which was doing joint research for the company after the Xenomorphs appeared. Paul laughs, saying it was the company who brought the Xenomorphs here. Instead of taking this seriously though, General Mustang dismisses it as a conspiracy theory with no evidence. Paul, who was frustrated by the company being here, began looking at what advice he could give. Paul was asked to this meeting as he led the group, and Shepard being a former colonial marine, they wanted his input as well. The first thing Paul says is to not underestimate the enemy. They are cunning, patient, and of unlimited number. Where there is one, it is always safe to assume that there is at least a dozen more laying in wait, though one is enough to kill a squad of trained soldiers if they are not careful. Flames will make one Xenomorph think twice, but in a group they'll happily charge through the flames. Paul suggests they send a team into the nuclear power plant, clear the area, then seal themselves inside by welding shut all ground entrances and monitor them with turrets. That'll leave the only way in through the air, which will be more easily defendable, especially if they can take out the flying Xenomorphs. Shepard then explains that the spaceport is in the heart of the capital city, where the hive first started, and retaking it will be difficult. There would be thousands, if not tens of thousands of Xenomorphs in the area alone, and that's before they even get inside. The The combat will be close quarters, room by room. They would no doubt be dealing with continuous ambushes and acid burns. Then, once the port was taken, keeping it secure would be another issue. No matter what, they will suffer heavy casualties. Paul once again suggests abandoning the planet, but the general shuts him down and asks what Paul and Shepard's opinion on retaking the government facility is. Paul says without having plans to the building, it's hard to know what to expect. The facility was also in one of the more heavily infested areas of the Xenomorph hive. The mission would be dangerous, and so Paul volunteers to go on it himself. At first, the general seemed reluctant to let Paul go. After all, he had no apparent military training, and clearly had an issue with Mr. Zulan, who would also be going to the research facility. To try and convince him, Paul informs the general that he had survived 2 previous Xenomorph outbreaks. This gets the attention of the executive, who smiles while Paul stares him down. Shepard then vouches for Paul, staking his honour as a former colonial marine and Paul's ability to survive and work in a team. Finally, the general agrees, but makes it clear he doesn't want to lose all of his new advisors in one mission. If Paul goes, then his team will not be going with him. It will be just Paul, a squad of the general's finest marines, Mr. Zulan, and his ESR team. Later that day, Paul meets with the rest of his group. When he tells them the executive had brought his own team, they all became concerned. While the rest of them had never come across an ESR team, Paul had back during the first outbreak on LV-289. That seemed like a lifetime ago, several lifetimes in fact. They had once given aid to the colonial marines, but once things looked bad, they had abandoned the human survivors and tried to force the marines to do the same. If it wasn't for the bravery and defiance of those few soldiers, then Paul would have died on that planet. Rachel was particularly reluctant to let Paul go alone on this mission. She could see why it was important, but also just how much of a risk it was. If things went wrong, the company almost certainly wouldn't hesitate to terminate Paul in the chaos. He knew this, of course, but stated he would be going anyway. At sunrise the following morning, Paul met with the Marines who he would be going with. To his disappointment, Sergeant Averson was not among them. Soon, the company executive alongside his ESR team and a strange-looking company android joined them on the roof, and they took off in a shuttle. What no one knew, however, was that the Elder Predator had stowed aboard. He had secretly infiltrated the Marine base and been keeping an eye on his survivor allies. Upon seeing the ESR teams, he decided he would follow them. After all, they had caused real issues for his hunting party during their quest to find the abomination. Dropship takes the group deep into infested territory. Only a few days before, the idea of being able to fly unopposed like this seemed impossible, but the Marines had won the battle for the skies of Vultra. There were still many flying xenomorphs, but the bulk of their forces had been wiped out. After about an hour of flight, they arrived at their destination, a skyscraper in the middle of the planet's second largest city. Their landing was unopposed, and the group quickly made their way inside the building. Mr. Zulan then explains that the facility in question is in the basement of this building, which he calls a necessary precaution. Paul was hardly excited at the notion of having to make his way down countless flights of stairs. However, to the surprise of Paul and the Marines, the building's elevator still worked. The executive told the group this wasn't that unusual. The building may have been a joint enterprise between the government and the company, but it was designed and built by the former. Several dozen backup generators were the normal for their buildings. Due to being in such a large group, they split across 2 elevators, company executive and his ESR team in one, and Paul and the Marines in the other. As they make their descent to the underground facility, Paul speaks to the Marines and warns them to keep an eye on the ESR team. He was absolutely certain they would betray them at the first chance they got. Unfortunately for Paul, the Marines seemed rather uninterested and were confused why this civilian had been allowed to come with them. Exiting the elevator, they find a facility devoid of any life. There was no sign of any researchers whatsoever, which was somewhat surprising considering the location of the facility and its apparent constant supply of power. The researchers easily could have remained here. Paul assumed that they must have abandoned the facility when their food ran out, but something didn't sit right with him. From Paul's experience, company and government facilities like these tended to use androids to help in their research. To Paul, it didn't seem like the company to not leave some androids behind to continue their experiments. He was unnerved by the very nature of this facility. Its layout and research eerily reminded him of the labs he had discovered on Nocturna. The very memory of them made him feel uneasy and stressed. Paul and the executive walk silently at the back of the group while the ESR team and the Marines check each room they come across for hostile alien life. And yet, in each room, they find no threats or sign of battle. Soon, the executive directs everyone into a larger room. He tells them this is the control centre for the facility, though to Paul, it just looks like another lab. Something just didn't feel right for him, so Paul quietly left the room and continued searching. Much deeper down the corridor and several turns away, Paul finds what appeared to be another laboratory. In the room, he sees a dozen or so xenomorphs in a containment cell. Inside was an equal amount of bodies scattered around. Paul knew this was supposed to be a joint research facility to find a way to save the planet from the xenomorphs. But this was barbaric. All of the bodies had clear signs of chest burster holes, but something else didn't seem right. It took Paul a second, but finally he realised it. All of the bodies were in government uniform. Not a single one of these bodies were from the company. Paul then heard a sound from behind him, and turning around he saw a security camera moving to face away from him. Paul didn't hesitate in running from the room and shouting for help, but it was too late. The door to the containment cell slowly began to open, releasing the xenomorphs inside. Paul didn't have long and he knew it. The xenomorphs would be chasing him down, and if he didn't either get back to the others or find a place to hide, he would be gone. There was no doubt in Paul's head that this was clearly a play by the executive to eliminate him before he could cause too much trouble. From around the corner, Paul could hear them coming. He knew they would catch him before he got back to the others, so he threw himself into the closest room. Looking around for a hiding place, he found an empty locker and went inside it. After a few seconds, a singular drone entered the room. It would seem the others had continued to stalk the facility for him. As the drone began searching, Paul readied his weapon. He could shoot the drone, but it would just draw the attention of the other xenomorphs back to him. That was truly a last resort. Through the grills of the vent, he watched as the drone checked everywhere within the room. Finally, it turned and approached his locker. Suddenly, it ripped the door open. Before Paul could pull the trigger and blow the xenomorph apart, it is thrown aside and then ripped in half. Stood before Paul, the elder predator gave a simple nod of understanding. Paul was thankful for the presence of the elder. Since it first appeared in Slew the Crusher all those months ago, it had saved Paul's and the other survivors' lives dozens of times, despite their reservations about it. Soon, gunfire erupts further down the corridor. Clearly, the xenomorphs had caught up to the others. The human and Yautja quickly make their way to the sounds of the gunfire, but find only dead marines and the last few remaining xenomorphs. Counting the number of bodies, it seemed at least 2 of the marines had survived. One of the 2 elevators had left. The elder and Paul quickly got into the next one and took it to the landing pad. When they got there, however, the shuttle was long gone. They had been abandoned. Together, the elder and Paul make their way back to the marine base. It wasn't easy and would take them 2 days. However, being just the 2 of them, they were able to move much quicker and quieter than when they were in a larger group. There was the odd xenomorph that the elder had to cut down, but for the most part their journey back was uneventful. That worried Paul to no end. A mere week before, these streets were swarming with thousands upon thousands of aliens, and now you could go for miles and only see a handful. The Marines had not cleared this area yet. Instead, the only answer to the lack of enemies was that the xenomorphs were up to something. Perhaps they were building up their strength in preparation for a single decisive strike against the Marines, or perhaps it was something more cunning. When the pair got back to the base, the elder once again disappeared. Paul handed himself back in, and after having to go through the same containment protocol for a few hours, he was released back to his people. His friends had been told that he was likely dead, but none of them believed it. After all, it would take more than that to kill Paul. Not long after returning, he was summoned to the command centre. Paul was not surprised to find the company executive and the remaining Marines waiting for him alongside General Mustang. The General tells Paul that he is glad to see him alive and wants to debrief again, this time with Paul there. Paul tries to argue that it was the company executive William Zulan who released the xenomorphs in an attempt to defeat him, but the Marines had backed up the executive's story. They had not seen the executive do it, and in fact blamed Paul for the deaths of their colleagues. In their mind, if Paul hadn't wandered off and come across a group of xenomorphs, then their teammates would still be here. The General calmed this argument and brought up the reports of their mission. Despite the casualties, it had been successful for the facility's data being retrieved. It contained details on every xenomorph cast they had come across, and the believed location of the Queen's chamber. Once the rest of the Liberation forces arrived in a few months, that section of the nest would become the focus of their assault. Reading the reports, Paul sees something is missing. He asks why the company android that came with them is missing in action, but when Paul was leaving the facility, he didn't see any destroyed androids. The executive said Paul must have missed him. Before they could argue over this, however, the alarm goes off. They all immediately start running. A voice comes over the sound system and says the alarm is coming from the communications room. That is not far from the command centre. It didn't make sense. How could a xenomorph infiltrate the facility without being spotted earlier? They kick the door open and find not some Xenomorph menace, but instead the elder Predator surrounded by unconscious Marines. He's just finished uploading something into the communication network. The general goes to shoot him, but Paul knocks the gun aside and gets in the way while shouting for the Predator to run and not to kill anyone. Respecting his allies' wishes, the Predator rips the support hatch open and withdraws. Furious, the general threatens to execute Paul right now if he doesn't start explaining. Before he got a chance to, however, the executive stepped in the way. He showed the general a report he conveniently had only just found. It stated that Paul was a wanted criminal who had sold company secrets on LV-289. Then, when he failed to do the same at Nocturna, he blew up the station, killing thousands of souls. It was all lies, of course, but that didn't matter to the executive. After all, it was convincing enough for the general to believe it. Paul was then knocked out by one of the Marines, and when he awoke he was alone, in a holding cell. Paul remained in his cell for several days. Every 12 hours his captors would bring him a military ration pack as a meal. On the fourth day of his confinement, the company executive Mr. Zalen visited him. Paul swore at the man, told him none of this would work, but he was ignored. Instead of saying anything, the executive stood there for several minutes grinning silently at his victory before leaving the room. Several hours later, the door to the cell room opened again, and like clockwork came his guard with the food. As the Marine approached the cell, he was suddenly thrown aside and knocked unconscious. Stood in the centre of the room was the Elder. Quickly, the rest of Paul's group, all of them, filtered into the room. Rachel told Paul they'd come to break him out. He protested, telling them they would get themselves in trouble and lose their ticket off-world. Rachel told him that was stupid. They needed to prove the company was lying, and asked Paul how he was going to do that from inside a cell. Even the Elder had come to help. Well, the group didn't exactly communicate with the Predator, but when they decided to break Paul out, he showed himself to the group and just kind of followed them, so she assumed he agreed. Besides, she tells him, they have a plan. The Elder rips the cell door off its hinges while Rachel explained. When the aliens first began to attack the planet, the company abandoned most of their bases and took over the planetary government's headquarters. If there was going to be files proving what the company had done, they would be there. Of course, the company may have purged them, but Davis's analysis suggested the chances of that was relatively slim. Before joining the survivors, he had served as an android in the planet's air traffic control team. When the others fled to the coming Xenomorph hordes, he was left behind, only leaving the facility himself once the power went out. But during the battle for the government HQ, he saw that a single shuttle with a company transponder flew to the base, only to be taken down at the last second. Davis believed that the head of the company on the planet had attempted to flee. It would be reasonable to assume that he would have a copy of all the important research documents on him as a consolidation prize for the company. So, that would be their destination once they broke out of the base. Getting out, however, would be the hard part. But Davis had an idea for that too. Avoiding the Marine patrols on the way to the roof wasn't an easy task. Luckily, when the Elder hacked into the communications network, he was able to access all of the Marine network devices, including the tracking in the Marines' helmets. Following the Elder, they secretly got to the roof. There were several drop shuttles all ripe for the taking. During his time in the Marines, Shepard had been friends of several pilots. He wasn't an expert by any category, but he could at least turn the ship on. Back on LV-289, Paul's job was flying the rocks from the mines to other facilities across the planet. Together, they would be able to somewhat fly the shuttle. Combine that with the help from Davis to control the autopilot, and they should be able to make it to their destination and back in one piece. As they approach one of the flyers, the worst-case situation happens. A group of engineers working on one of the dropships sees them and shouts for help. The group fires loosely in the direction of the engineers, purposefully missing as to only scare them. Quickly, they run onto the shuttle and take off. Initially, they are pursued by two other Marine gunships that threaten to shoot them down, but using the hacked communication network, the Elder sends a fake message from the base ordering the other two gunships to pull off, which reluctantly they did. Free from their pursuers, the survivors continue to their destination. As they approached the government headquarters, they were shocked to see a lack of Xenomorph activity. Just like with the research facility, the Xenomorphs had seemingly stopped operating in large numbers across the planet. It just didn't make sense, and that concerned Paul. Landing on the roof, they come across a singular skeleton. While the survivors checked it for the plans, the Elder pauses on the roof and stares towards one side of the ledge. Paul had no idea what had gone into the Hunter, but could tell this place held some significance for him. Davis confirmed that this skeleton was likely to be the company representative, but he didn't have the plans on him. Most likely they were blown away by the wind or lost during his attempt to escape. The android suggests they check the control room in case the man was ambushed and had to flee before he could delete the files. So leaving the rest of the group behind to guard the shuttle, Paul, Davis, Rachel and the Elder continue inside the facility. The carnage was extraordinarily brutal, even for the Xenomorphs. With nowhere left to run, the last of the planetary defense and ESR teams put up a bloody defense, but it was not enough. Soon, the group find the control center they were looking for, and with bated breath, they watched as Davis used a portable generator from the shuttle to boot the computers back online. He then trawled through the millions of files on the network. Most of them were partially deleted or incomplete, but the evidence was overwhelming. With this, they would be able to prove what the company had done. There was more though. Deep in the files, Davis found mention of Project Ragnarok. Pulling the files up, Paul felt his heart drop as he realised just what the company had planned. Ragnarok was an experimental device funded by both the government and the company. When detonated deep underground, the device would release an extreme heat wave, burning all life on the planet, no matter how resistant said life was. The heat wave would then crack the planet open, splitting it into thousands of asteroids. The proposal had been to use it to break open uninhabitable planets, and make the harvesting of underground minerals easier, but the company had intended to use it as a failsafe in the case of a xenomorph outbreak. The project had been abandoned, however, after it was found to be far too expensive for mass production. In fact, only one functional prototype was ever constructed, and it was currently located in a secret part of the governmental and company research labs Paul had visited days earlier. Clearly, the executive had more than one reason to visit that facility. With their prize downloaded onto a portable storage device, the survivors made their way back to the others. As they reach the group, however, they hear a frightening sound. Looking over to the horizon, they see hundreds, if not thousands, of flying xenomorphs gliding in a singular direction. Using the shuttle's radar, Davis calculated they were heading directly towards the spaceport. It seemed whatever the xenomorphs had planned, it had begun. Loading onto the shuttle, the survivors took off back towards the Marine base. On the way, they attempted to use the communications array, but found the shuttle's comms had unsurprisingly been jammed. After their escape, the Marines had even managed to cut the Elder's connection from the communications array. As they approached the base, they expected to be shot down. However, they found that it was mostly abandoned, with only a handful of shuttles remaining. Landing on the roof, they were met by defensive androids and Sergeant Averson. The sergeant explained that the company executive had been arguing for them to be shot down upon their return. But in order to return the favour of saving his life, the sergeant had convinced the general to allow them to land. Besides, they had far more important matters at hand. The sergeant escorts the group to see the general. Upon entering the command centre, they see that Mustang has a grim look on his face. Sergeant Averson then explains that they had launched their assault on the spaceport. It wasn't going well. The general had committed the majority of his forces to the attack, only keeping a token force led by Sergeant Averson to defend the base. However, just as Shepard and Paul had warned, the battle had been brutal. In General Mustang's arrogance, he believed that his Marines were far superior to the Xenomorphs and would make easy work for the aliens. The consequences of his foolishness was now plain to see. From the moment they landed, thousands of Xenomorphs appeared from underground and swarmed to the facility. It seemed the hive had been consolidating its forces in the Queen's Nest, which was in the same city and had been waiting for the humans to make their move. Over half the colonial marine force had been wiped out in the attack, and those that were left were pinned down and split across the landing pads and inside the heart of the facility. The Elder moved closer to one of the screens where a live feed from a Marine's helmet played. He watched as half a dozen Marines were cut down in a few seconds by Bobby the predalien. Paul interrupts the Marines and on the monitor pulls up the files they had taken from the government facility. Finally, he was able to give conclusive proof that the company had been behind everything from the beginning. All of this death and destruction had been orchestrated by them. The general threw his head into his hands. He admits he was wrong. If he had just listened to Paul to begin with, then he could have avoided throwing his troops to their demise at the spaceport. He finally agrees with Paul that the planet must be destroyed, and they would use this Project Ragnarok to do it. But first, he orders the company executive to be arrested for his company's crimes. When they arrived at the executive's quarters, however, they found he had fled from the base. The only conclusion the general could draw was that the executive had bugged the base to listen in on their conversations. According to radar, Mr. Zulan was on a shuttle heading straight to the site of Project Ragnarok. The survivors, General Mustang and Sergeant Averson, gather back around in the control room. Paul theorises that the company sent Mr. Zulan to the planet with the express purpose of monitoring the situation and getting control of Project Ragnarok. The company wouldn't want to risk any evidence of their involvement being discovered, so if the Marines were successful in liberating the planet, the executive probably would have just detonated the device, taking out the planet and the Marines while he fled with some specimens. If the Marines failed, They could try and dissuade the government from allowing the rest of the Liberation fleet onto the planet, and instead allow the company to use it as one massive live laboratory for the Xenomorphs. The group agree on their final course of action. They would split into two separate teams. Team 1 would be comprised of Paul, Gunnar, Luke, Laura, Davis, and a handful of Marines. They would go to Project Ragnarok and gain control of the superweapon. At the same time, Team 2, comprised of Sergeant Avison, Rachel, the remainder of her old team, Shepard and Dipper, would take the Marine forces left and go to the planetary spaceport in order to relieve the Marine forces trapped there, and assist in them retreating back to the ship in orbit. General Mustang would be leading Team 2 personally, despite protests from Sergeant Avison. He tells the sergeant that this is his duty. He condemned these Marines to their fate, and he sure as hell won't abandon them now. As they debate this, the Elder taps his hand against the image of the spaceport several times, making it clear that he will accompany the second team there. It went without saying that both missions would be tough. While Paul's team wouldn't be fighting Xenomorphs, they would be taking on an ESR team. They were some of the toughest fighters money could buy. Ideally, Paul wished he could have had more people to go with him, but the liberation of the spaceport was important too. They couldn't just leave all of those Marines to their fate. With their directions set, the group are given less than an hour to make their final preparations. Paul and Rachel spend their final minutes together on the roof. They had been through so much together since they met on Nocturna. Now here they were, with the ending finally in sight. There was no need for words between them. They understood each other in a way few could, and both implicitly knew the feelings they had for one another. Perhaps, if they both survived the coming battle, they would give voice to those feelings, but they knew the chances were at least one of them wouldn't be coming back. Eventually, they were joined by the others on the roof. Everyone was silently resigned to what they had to do and the struggle that faced them. Just as the group were about to board their shuttles, however, the Elder shouted something in his strange language. Suddenly, several lights began to shine on the roof as multiple Vultra spaceships deactivated their cloaking devices. From their boarding ramps came dozens of predators, all ready to join the Elder on his hunt. What the humans didn't know is that when the Elder hacked into the humans' communication network, he didn't do it for no reason. Instead, he had hijacked the system to send a message to the ship in orbit, which was then sent throughout the stars. It was an open message to his clan, a call to join him on this ultimate hunt. With these predators, the humans' chance of success greatly increased. And so, they take off in their shuttles. It would be Paul's team who arrived at their target location first. The landing pads were devoid of enemies. They expected their foes would be dug in deep underground and prepared for any kind of assault. This assumption was correct, as in the lobby of the laboratory, several ESR members waited crouched behind their sandbags. When the elevator doors opened, they released a hail of gunfire. But instead of living enemies, they found automated turrets waiting for them. During the ensuing gunfight, an ESR member managed to take out a pair of auto turrets in one of the elevators, only to be gunned down by the ones in the other. Using the defeat of his comrades as a distraction, an ESR member threw a grenade into the elevator, taking out the turrets. They would not be given a chance to breathe, however, as in the next second the roofs of both elevators were blown open by breaching charges as the Marines rappelled down and began shooting their enemies. Several Marines died in the struggle, but they managed to secure the lobby. Given a chance for the rest of their strike team to enter, Paul would rappel down the elevator just in time for the lobby door to open, revealing multiple security bots, just like the ones on LV-289. Approaching the spaceport, Rachel looked out of her shuttle window to see thousands, if not tens of thousands of Xenomorphs swarming the building. The shuttles were doing what they could to stem the tide of Xenomorphs outside, but were unable to give any support to the Marines on the landing pads. Their firepower was that great that if they tried to, they would probably rip the structure apart instead. Their shuttle would bring them to a landing pad a third of the way up the building, and from the moment her team exited the shuttle, they began fighting. Instantly, Rachel let her former training kick in. Now was not the time to let the seemingly insurmountable odds get the better of her. It was the time to focus on their objective, to support the troops already here and breaking through the Xenomorph lines so they could relieve the colonial Marines trapped inside, and then return to the landing pads for evac. And so, Rachel fought as allies were torn apart left and right by Xenomorphs. Yet with every Marine killed, the humans refused to give up ground and instead held their position and awaited the cavalry. It didn't take long for them to arrive. Just as the next wave of Xenomorphs began to charge Rachel's position, a dozen predators came leaping from above and began carving a bloody path into the base. Rallying behind them, Rachel's forces charged. Things were not going well for Paul. Most of the Marines had traded their lives to bring down the security bots. As the last few approached the group, Gunner grabbed a rocket launcher off the body of a Marine and blasted the bots apart. With the area clear, they progressed to the lab's fake control room. Once inside, Davis connected himself to the database and began scouring it for the entrance to Project Ragnarok. As it so happened, the doorway was located behind a fake wall in the very room they were in. Before they had time to process what was happening, the door flew open and the remaining ESR operatives opened fire. The survivors ran to cover and to shoot back, but in the chaos, Gunner was taken down. Paul watched as his friend's lifeless body hit the ground. Enraged, he kept firing into the doorway. The ESR teams may have been better soldiers, but they were far too outnumbered by the survivors, who managed to beat them through sheer firepower. As they moved down the corridor, the group came into a small control room. Waiting for them was a strange android the executive had brought with him when they visited here before. As Paul entered the room, he was set upon by the executive William Zulan, who pounced from a locker and began wrestling with Paul. Paul's friends tried their best, but were unable to line up a shot. The executive got a solid hit before pushing the disorientated Paul through the window. As he fell, Paul grabbed the executive by the wrist and dragged him out the window with him. The pair crashed onto a catwalk below. As they got to their feet, the executive produced a knife and charged at Paul. Thus began a brutal brawl. All of the pain Paul had felt since LV-289 came bursting out. The two injure each other multiple times before the executive slices Paul across the chest. Ignoring the pain, he wrenches the knife from the executive's hand and with a roar places it in his opponent's chest. Paul collapses and rolls onto his back. Taking deep breaths, he laughs to himself. Somehow he had survived yet another fight he should not have. Getting to his feet, Paul shouts to the others to let them know that he is okay. Now he just needs to get back up to them. In the heart of the spaceport, the Elder and his hunting party finally find Bobby the predalien. They ambush the abomination and attempt to take it down, but as Bobby has done time and time again, once he realised he was outnumbered, he ran away. Soon after, Rachel and her team rendezvoused the Marines trapped inside. It's clear they are all broken and tired. They had been fighting for over 12 hours straight, and victory seemed like an impossibility, even with these creatures supporting them. Witnessing this dismal state of affairs, the General steps forward. He gives an inspiring speech about loyalty, about how they were the best of the best and they would not be defeated here. He ends the speech by asking if they would let a desk commander defeat more Xenomorphs than them, and with that, he picked up his rifle and charged into the Xenomorphs. His Marines did not hesitate to follow him, as they began their battle to escape the spaceport. Arriving back in the control room, Paul sees Davis tinkering with the company android. Davis had convinced the others not to destroy it and had instead rewired the android to serve their needs. It turned out Project Ragnarok hadn't actually been completed. While the device itself worked fine, it required someone to manually activate it. This was what the company had planned to use the android for. Now Paul could do the same. Davis shows Paul a detonator and tells him when the button is pressed, it will send a signal to the android, who will activate Project Ragnarok and destroy the planet. With their objective complete, Paul's team leave to join their allies at the spaceport. Meanwhile, the Elder and his party followed Bobby underground right into the heart of the Xenomorph's nest. Their fury was not halted, however, as they cut down hordes of Xenomorphs. The group even made short work of a Praetorian who was guarding the tunnel the abomination had fled down. The Predators had no doubt in their mind they were about to enter the chamber of Queen Michael. As they enter the room, they realise that Michael was no longer a queen, for she had ascended into an empress. These empresses were so rare that even many Yautja considered them nothing but a myth. Even the Elder, who had been alive for centuries, had never seen one, and until today doubted they existed. But the story said that when a Xenomorph hive achieved complete dominance over its environment, there was a chance that its queen would morph into an empress, growing in size to be as tall as buildings and becoming far tougher and deadlier. To any other species, this may have been considered a horrifying sight, but the Yautja became excited. The chance to hunt a foe as worthy as this was not something every Yautja lived long enough to see. The Elder watches as his people start destroying all the eggs in the chamber. Michael the Empress lets out a chilling scream which should have deafened lesser beings, before the Empress approaches to fight these intruders. Before it can get to the Yautja, there is an earth-shaking explosion and the roof begins to cave in around the Empress. Bobby had come prepared and laid a trap by getting another hunting party to rig the building above to explode. It was supposed to be a last-ditch failsafe, to only be used if their party were defeated and unable to detonate their wrist bracers. But there was no dishonour in using it against an empress. After all, it would hardly put a dent in the creature. The empress shook off the rubble and looked around. There were dozens of Yautjas firing their shoulder cannons directly at it. Even a being as powerful as this wasn't blind to the threat these predators pose. It was then that Michael did something unexpected. It began to dig upwards. Bursting from the ground, the creature began marching down the streets of the city, while the predators gave chase, all except for one, that is. Instead of following the larger prey, the Elder stared down into the pit and saw his target, Bobby the predalien. The Elder leaped down into the pit and roared at the creature. There was nowhere for it to run now, not that it would. The abomination had defeated this predator before, and was confident in its ability to do so again. And so, in this crater that once was a royal chamber, Bobby the predalien and the Elder battled one final time. As Paul's gunship arrives at the capital, it sees the Empress as it marched down the street. Below it, dozens of predators gave chase but were too slow to keep up with the creature. Paul had never seen a Xenomorph this size before. He had assumed the one he saw in Nocturna was the largest they could grow. Clearly he was wrong. About a dozen or so human gunships haphazardly fired what little ordnance they had left into the Empress, but it simply brushes the attacks off as if they were annoying insects. In horror, Paul realises the destination of the creature and desperately tries to send a warning. In the spaceport, Rachel's team and the Marines break through the Xenomorphs and get onto the landing pad. They run out into the open just in time for Michael the Empress to pop its head over the ledge. It had climbed its way up using the lower landing pads as footholds. The monster slams its fist down, crushing Sergeant Averson and several Marines to a pulp. The Marines find themselves trapped between the Empress and dozens of Xenomorphs which were arriving from all directions. The Marines try shooting at the Empress, but their guns do nothing to it. Not even the gunships were capable of damaging the creature. They needed something far stronger. The Empress grabs a chunk of rubble from the landing pad and throws it at a gunship, causing it to explode and crash into the spaceport doorway, blocking the humans' escape. Rachel battles her way through a small group of Xenomorphs and grabs hold of General Mustang. Screaming at him, she asks if the Colonial Marine frigate in orbit has enough range to hit the planet. The General confirms that it does, but warns that firing from orbit can be inaccurate. As the second gunship crashes into the spaceport as a result of the Empress throwing rubble, Rachel yells at the General to just do it. They can't escape while the monster is here anyway. And so, the General gives the order over his communications array. In orbit above, the captain of the ship confirms the order before moving his vessel to make an aiming solution. Moving into position, it fires its main battle cannon directly towards the planet. Its shot penetrating the planet's atmosphere with great speed before missing wildly and demolishing an entire apartment block. With their exit blocked and the Empress making evacuation an impossibility, the humans are forced to hold their ground until the frigate can fire another shot. But the situation looks grim, with an endless swarm of Xenomorphs flooding onto the landing pad. The humans were beginning to run out of ammunition. They wouldn't be able to hold out for much longer. The Xenomorph known as Frost has joined the fray, cutting down multiple Marines as he and a large contingent of scout Xenomorphs began dropping from the roof above. Suddenly, a Praetorian comes crashing onto the spaceport and charges directly for Rachel's position. Lining up a perfect shot, Shepard uses his grenade launcher on his weapon to blast one of the creature's legs off. Regardless, the Xenomorph continues its advance. Taking action, Shepard launched onto the creature and unloaded an entire clip into its neck, finishing it off. Before he had time to celebrate, however, multiple warriors jumped at him and began tearing the old man apart. Roaring in defiance, Shepard grabbed the two of the Xenomorphs and, using the last of his strength, rolled with their attacks, allowing all three of them to tumble off the side of the ledge. As they fell, he detonated a grenade, taking the warriors with him. In the nest, the Elder continued his brutal battle with the abomination. At this point, the battle had turned into a brawl. The Elder had learnt from his previous mistakes and is not acting overconfident. Instead, he is taking his time, tanking the weaker hits and avoiding strikes from Bobby's tail. At one point, the predalien tries to pull back to get some distance, but the Elder throws a shuriken. As Bobby dodges the attack, the Elder slams into the Xenomorph, slashing at him with his wrist bracer. Their fight continues, with each of them pushing through their many wounds. Paul's gunship watches helplessly as the teams on the landing pad are slowly picked off one by one. Hoping to give some range support from a nearby building, Paul lands his shuttle on the roof and everyone begins disembarking. As Davis steps off the shuttle, he turns to call for Paul, who was the last one on board. But before anyone could process what was happening, the door to the shuttle closed and Paul took off again. On the landing pad, the Empress continued throwing chunks of rubble and slamming her fist into the ground. One such punch landed square in the middle of a Marine formation, crushing General Mustang and his guards. The plummeting of the morale of the Marines caused by the death of their general couldn't be overstated. It truly did look like the end for the humans. In the chaos, their left flank began to fall as Frost the Xenomorph and the other runners began overwhelming the Marines. As the Empress wound up its claw to strike again, Paul's shuttle slammed into it at full speed, causing Michael to lose her grip and tumble down into the rubble below. Paul's shuttle was flung wildly off course and crashed into the ground nearby. As the Empress began to stand, all of the remaining Marine gunships began to circle Michael and fired coordinated synced shots at the monster. These strikes weren't enough to penetrate the Empress's thick hide, but that wasn't the point. The impact of dozens of missiles hitting the Empress at the exact same time was enough to cause the disorientated leader to stumble backwards away from the spaceport. The timing was perfect, as the predators had finally caught up to their prey and began reinforcing the humans. The Oucher climbed the Empress while hacking and slashing at its joints, while others used their shoulder cannons to target the Xenomorph's ankles. The humans used speakers built into their shuttles to warn the predators to move out the way. The Ouchers withdraw just in time as a second battle cannon blast from the frigate in orbit struck the ground. It would miss, but this shot was far closer than the previous one and sent the Empress tumbling back down to the ground. Now aware of the cannon, the other Yautja kept their distance and used shoulder cannons to blast at the creature's joints, where its armor was weakest with pinpoint accuracy. Bobby the Predalien launches at the Elder, who dodges out of the way and stabs upwards, catching the abomination at the leg. Before he can seize on his victory, he is knocked aside by Bobby's tail. The Predalien charges at the wounded Elder, ready to finish his prey. But at the last second, the Elder countercharges and throws himself forward, barely dodging the abomination's strike as he slashes outwards, cutting a large X shape into Bobby's chest. The Predalien falls backwards, wheezing as acid blood pours out of its open wounds. It tries to strike with its tail, but the Elder catches the strike and cuts the tail off. He stands over the abomination and watches. This thing was birthed from the body of Kratos, a young Yautja that the Elder had high hopes for. In his own hunt to exterminate this affront to his culture, the Elder had led what remained of his hunting party to their demise. He had lost to the creature and failed to defeat it multiple times, and yet here he was, triumphant. Despite everything he had lost in this pursuit, the Elder couldn't argue that this abomination was the greatest prey he had ever hunted. Taking his wrist bracer, he finished Bobby off and took his head as a trophy. At long last, his honour was redeemed. On the streets above, Michael the Empress begins using a building to claw its way back to its feet. It takes a single step towards the spaceport, before being knocked back into the building once more as Paul's damaged and on-fire shuttle slammed into its chest. It struck the creature with such speed that the ship ricocheted backwards and slammed into the roof of a shorter nearby building. The shuttle would not take off again, but it achieved its goal of buying precious time. As the Empress pulled itself away from the building, it roared in anger. It would be the last sound Michael ever made, for in that moment the third railgun shot entered the atmosphere and struck home, obliterating the Empress with enough force to send chunks of the creature's acid-dripping flesh flying in all directions. With their leader gone, the hive was thrown into disarray. What had mere minutes before been a coordinated, formidable force turned into disorganized rabble. Seizing the moment, the shuttles began landing at the spaceport to evacuate the remaining forces. In the chaos, the Yautja seemingly disappeared from the face of the planet. Rachel boards the same shuttle that had picked up the remainder of Paul's team and demands that the pilot go find Paul's shuttle. This pilot is reluctant at first, but can see from the look on Rachel's face there is no point arguing. When they find Paul, all that was left of his ship was a burning wreck. With everyone else's help, they began pulling away what pieces they could. The pilot protests, telling them they have dozens of Xenomorphs climbing the building and they need to go now. Trapped beneath a large metal beam, Rachel finds Paul. With the assistance of Davis and his android strength, they remove the beam and place it aside. Paul was covered in cuts and wounds from where the shrapnel had hit him, but he was alive. They drag him out of the rubble and onto the shuttle, just in time to take off as the Xenomorphs arrived on the roof. When they arrived onto the shuttle in orbit, the marine medics managed to stabilize Paul's condition. When he awoke hours later, he was surrounded by his fellow survivors, by people who had become not just his friends, but his family. He was told about how Shepard died to save Rachel, and the many other casualties they had suffered. It was just all too surreal. Paul wanted to cry, to let his grief out, but he was just too in shock that he was still alive. He asked if Ragnarok worked, and the group all stared at each other. Davis then pulled out the detonator and handed it to Paul. He tells him that they knew they should have detonated it immediately, but they felt it was only right that he did it. Grunting in pain, Paul stood up from his bed and walked towards the nearest window. Outside he saw Vultra, the planet he had spent so long on, and where he had suffered so much. Paul activated the detonator, and together with the others, he watched as the planet burnt and then exploded. In that inferno, this chapter of Paul's life ended. That night, Paul couldn't sleep. Leaving Rachel in the bed that they had shared, he walked aimlessly through the corridors of the ship. Finally, he came to an observation deck where he stared at the ruined asteroids of Vultra. His attention was only broken when he heard a familiar, unfamiliar language. Turning, he saw the Elder. Paul had no idea how he had gotten aboard the ship, but knew it was pointless to ask. The Predator handed Paul a knife. He'd seen pictures of ones like this in his history books as a kid. What he would find out later was that this weapon was over 1,000 years old. After giving it to Paul, the Predator nodded at the human, who nodded in return. He knew this was the last time he would see the Elder. He knew there was no need, but Paul said thank you anyway, and watched as the Oucher activated his cloaking and disappeared. Paul turned back to stare out the window once more, and he smiled. He knew things weren't completely over. The company was still out there and potentially had more Xenomorphs. But now they had proof to expose the company's many crimes. It would be a long road, but with his family he would be able to face it head on. For the first time since Paul first saw a Xenomorph in LV-289, the future seemed just a little bit brighter. Thank you for watching The Life of a Xenomorph.